It was a cold weekend in January of 2016. My close friends and I lived right next to a massive and beautiful nature preserve. In our small town, there is never really much to do on weekends, so we spent our time exploring. On this Saturday, we wanted some adventure. We decided to head down to the massive concrete storm drain that supplied water to the creek inside the preserve. We had seen this place a million times, but we had never actually tried to go inside. The entrance was blocked by a heavy metal barred barricade. It was bolted tightly into the concrete to keep people out. Since we could not get in, we decided to throw some rocks through the bars. We wanted to hear them splash to figure out how deep the drain went. But after throwing one rock, something happened that made our blood run cold. We threw the rock, heard it bounce, and then a couple of seconds of dead silence passed. Suddenly, a terrifying heavy thump rang out from deep within the darkness. It sounded like something had slammed back against the wall in response. It was a loud, angry bang. We stood there in the quiet woods, staring at each other in complete disbelief. Dusk was approaching, so we called it a day and went home. The next weekend, the curiosity was too much. I gathered a few more friends, making 5 of us. We walked back down, stood in front of the barricade, and began unbolting it. Soon, the metal barricade fell down and we entered. We turned on our flashlights. The main tunnel only went about 20 feet to a dead end, but to our left, there was a second branch. We took a step up and proceeded one by one. At first, it was nothing but webs and mud. We walked deep into the drain, about 500 feet, as it kept getting skinnier. We had to duck to move. Suddenly, we all froze. Out of the pitch black, we heard the exact same heavy thump from before. We had no cell signal and were terrified. We were huddled close together, and we knew the sound came from much further down. My friend started recording. We turned around and ran out. Later, when I reviewed the video, my heart stopped. At one turn, there was an outline of a head. It could not have been any of us. I took a screenshot and zoomed in. There in the frame was a demon-shaped head with glowing eyes and pointy ears. We never went back to that place. Our next story takes us to the border city of Laredo, Texas. In this city, there is a very strong, deeply rooted Hispanic culture, which brings with it a lot of local legends and ghost stories. My friends and I had recently picked up a hobby of exploring abandoned warehouses. There were endless rumors surrounding a specific cluster of abandoned industrial buildings near the edge of town. The local myth was that these old warehouses were heavily haunted by the spirits of immigrant workers who had been worked to death and mistreated by their employers years ago. The local news had actually covered the tragic deaths of several workers at these sites over the decades, but many of the incidents were ignored by the authorities due to the illegal status of the laborers. The specific warehouse we decided to visit belonged to an old company that used to maintain railroad tracks and dispose of hazardous materials. When we first walked into the property during the day, we could see massive metal barrels filled with chemical waste that had been left behind, spilled wide open on the concrete floor. We felt very uneasy there. We decided to do a 2-part exploration. First, we checked out the buildings during the day, and then we returned at night. During our daytime walkthrough, we stumbled upon something incredibly disturbing. In a dusty corner, we found the remains of what looked like a satanic ritual. There was a severed chicken foot on the ground, and pentagrams had been drawn on the walls. We also noticed a makeshift bed with old blankets, indicating someone was living there. When we returned that night, the entire energy of the place was different. We got the strong feeling we were being watched. A flock of crows roosting in the rafters started flying down, trying to attack us. We kept moving deeper, trying to ignore them, but we kept seeing dark shadows. Suddenly, a creepy laugh echoed through the room. That laugh was our cue to get out. We turned and ran, but as we passed the spot with the chicken foot, we noticed something that made our stomachs drop. The chicken foot and the drawings were completely gone. Someone had cleaned them up, which meant we were not alone. As we scrambled outside, the crows chased us into the night. We never went back. We realized that the people performing those dark rituals had been hiding in the shadows, watching us the entire night. Now let us move on to a story that took place at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I was a freshman at the time, living in the campus dorms and trying to adjust to college life. One weekend, a group of my friends came back to the dorms late at night after attending a hockey team party. They brought a few girls along with them who they had known back in high school and who happened to be visiting the city. We all gathered in one of the dorm rooms to hang out. One of the girls who came with them was incredibly friendly, smiling and talking to everyone, but she was also extremely drunk. However, the strange thing was that I never actually saw her take a single drink while she was inside our dorm. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, my girlfriend and I decided it was time to leave, so we walked back to my own room. About an hour later, at 3 in the morning, I was startled by the sound of loud sirens. I looked out my window and could see the flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles reflecting off the campus buildings. At first, I did not think much of it. In a college dorm, it is very common for someone to come home with severe alcohol poisoning. But then, a sound ripped through the quiet hallway that I will never forget. It was the most gut-wrenching, agonizing scream I have ever heard. I opened my door and stepped out. My friends came running, their faces pale, screaming for my help. I followed them, and as we got closer, I noticed bright red blood smeared on the floor. I thought someone had been stabbed, but when I looked inside, I saw 3 police officers and paramedics struggling to strap the friendly girl onto a stretcher. She was thrashing violently, growling like an animal, and bleeding heavily from both nostrils. My friend said that out of nowhere, her eyes rolled back and she started growling. She had suddenly turned violent, attacking our friends, pulling their hair and trying to bite them. This girl was only 5 feet tall and weighed 110 pounds, but she displayed absolute superhuman strength, fighting off 3 muscular men. Our resident advisor came over and began to pray. The moment he started praying, she went into a frenzy, screaming profanities and yelling that the devil was coming for all of us. She screamed that they are coming for us next. She later woke up with no memory of what happened, but we will never forget the terror of that night. It was a terrible experience. Our final story comes from a small, quiet town where winters are long and there is almost nothing for teenagers to do. My friend Drake and I had to make our own fun. One cold afternoon, after we finished ice fishing, we went back to my house. The snow was falling heavily, and we decided it would be fun to pass the time by throwing snowballs at passing cars. Usually, people would just ignore us or get a little annoyed, but nobody ever got truly angry. It was just harmless winter fun, but on this day we picked the wrong car. Drake decided to throw one last snowball at a car coming down the road, and he told me to record it on my phone. He hid right by the passenger side of my driveway and threw it. The snowball made a loud, hard impact as it hit the side of the car. We stood there laughing for a second, but our laughter quickly died when we saw the brake lights turn on. The driver slowed down, came to a complete stop, and then aggressively threw the car into reverse. We knew we had to run now. We panicked. We ran as fast as we could and hid behind a car parked in a nearby empty parking lot. The angry driver pulled into the same lot, stopping just 5 feet away from where we were crouching. Luckily, he did not see us through the falling snow. As soon as he turned his head, we bolted back to my house, ran inside, and locked the front door. We took off our heavy winter jackets and sat down on the couch, trying to catch our breath and watch the video I had just recorded. But before we could even press play, we were interrupted by a massive, violent boom. Someone was pounding on our front door with incredible force. I froze in my seat. I did not think there was any way this guy could have tracked us back to my house. My dog started barking frantically and going absolutely crazy. Drake and I were only 14 years old. We usually did not get scared easily, but this was different. The banging was so loud it felt like the door was going to splinter open. We were completely terrified. We locked ourselves in the bathroom and turned off the light. We tried to laugh, but the banging would not stop. I called my mom, who was at the Walmart. She was angry at us, but said she would call a neighbor to scare him. Suddenly, the banging at the front door stopped, but then the same violent pounding started at our back door. I realized that I had forgotten to lock it. My mom called back, her voice trembling. She said a neighbor saw a deranged man peering through my window. Drake and I ran to her room to grab the old shotgun, but when we stepped inside, we froze. There, pressed against the window, was a hairy, withered face staring at us. We screamed and ran. Drake grabbed my speaker and blasted a police siren. Just as the siren wailed, we heard the back door swing open. The man was inside, but the loud siren sound did the trick. We heard him scramble back and flee. Moments later, our neighbor Paul arrived and stayed with us until the police arrived. The police told us we got lucky. You never know who you are dealing with. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. For many of us, the month of October is the absolute best time of the year. There is a crisp chill in the air. The leaves are turning beautiful shades of orange and gold, and everyone is getting ready for Halloween. It is a time for cozy sweaters, pumpkin carving, and late-night walks. But October also has a darker side. As the nights get longer and the shadows stretch out, the line between festive fun and real-life terror can get incredibly blurry. Sometimes, the monsters we think are just part of the holiday are actually very real, and they are standing right behind us. Back in October of 2016, a college student decided to take a seasonal job at a local Party City store. If you have ever been inside one of those stores during the autumn season, you know exactly how chaotic it can get. People are rushing in to buy last-minute decorations, paper plates, and of course, Halloween costumes. Because the narrator of this story was a college student who did not have any early morning classes, he ended up getting stuck with the late-night shifts on weekdays. During the peak of the Halloween rush, the store changed its closing hours on weeknights, staying open all the way until 11 p.m. His typical shift would start around 5 in the afternoon and run straight through until closing time. During the first few hours of his shift, the store would be absolutely packed, but as the clock ticked past 9, the heavy rush would start to die down. By 10, the aisles would be practically empty, especially on quiet weekdays. On one particular night, our narrator started his shift, working as what the store called a costume grabber. This job was pretty simple but physically exhausting. He would stand near the back wall wearing a walkie-talkie. A customer would look at the costume displays, decide what they wanted, and then a cashier would tell the narrator over the radio which costume and what size to grab from the massive storage area. He would run, grab the costume, hand it to the customer, and wait for them to try it on. As the night progressed and the store went quiet, the supervisor told him to switch tasks. It was time to start cleaning up the messy aisles, restocking the picked-over shelves, and moving inventory back and forth between the main floor and the basement. Now, this basement was connected directly to the upstairs costume storage room, so he did not have to walk across the main sales floor every time. But carrying heavy, awkward boxes up and down those narrow concrete stairs got exhausting very quickly. By the time 10 o'clock rolled around, there were only 4 people left working in the entire building. There was a girl named Maria who was handling the front cash register, a guy named Kyle who was cleaning the far aisles and restocking shelves, a night supervisor named Ashley, and our narrator. After lifting heavy boxes for hours, the narrator decided to take a quick 10-minute breather in the break area to catch his breath. When his break was over, he walked back toward the basement door to continue hauling boxes of children's costumes up to the main storage room. But when he reached the door, he noticed something strange. The lights in the basement had been turned completely off. He figured Ashley must have turned them off to conserve energy, so he did not think much of it. He reached out, flipped the light switch back on, and walked down the cold concrete steps. He walked over to a stack of boxes and bent down to lift a heavy container of girls' costumes. Just as he got his hands under the box, he heard a sudden, loud sound on the far side of the basement. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. The basement was not massive, but it was laid out in a large circle. The entire space was crammed with tall stacks of boxes, and there was one massive metal storage shelf running right down the middle, completely blocking his view of the other side. The narrator slowly put the heavy box back down. He felt a sudden wave of unease, but he tried to convince himself it was just a box shifting on its own. He slowly walked to the edge of the metal shelf and peered his head around the corner to see what had fallen. What he saw made him freeze instantly. Standing on the other side of the basement was a figure dressed in a white, hooded robe costume. They were wearing a grotesque, scary monster mask. The narrator gasped and jumped backward in shock. But almost immediately, he assumed it was one of his coworkers trying to scare him. He let out a nervous laugh and told the figure that they had gotten him good. He waited for them to take off the mask and laugh, but the figure did not say a word. Instead, they just slowly tilted their head to the side, staring at him through the dark eye holes of the mask. The narrator initially thought it was Ashley, because she was known for playing jokes on the staff. But as he looked closer, he realized this person was far too tall to be Ashley. He figured it had to be Kyle. He took a step forward, intending to reach out and pull the mask off himself. But as he got closer, the figure immediately took a step backward, keeping their distance. The narrator stopped. He looked down at the figure's feet, and his heart skipped a beat. The person was wearing heavy, dirty, mud-caked work boots. The narrator knew for an absolute fact that Kyle was wearing clean, light sneakers that night. A cold shudder ran through his entire body. He realized that this was not a joke, and this was not one of his coworkers. He did not want to panic or show the intruder that he was terrified, so he slowly backed away toward the stairs. He kept his eyes on the masked figure as he climbed the steps, closed the basement door behind him, and walked quickly toward the front of the store. He found Ashley and Maria standing by the front registers chatting. He tried to keep his voice calm as he asked them where Kyle was. Just as he asked, Kyle's voice called out from a nearby aisle, asking what they needed. That was the exact moment pure panic set in. The narrator looked at Ashley and asked if anyone else was supposed to be working in the store that night. Ashley shook her head and said that everyone else had gone home hours ago. The narrator explained that there was a stranger in a white robe and a monster mask hiding in the basement. Kyle and Ashley grabbed heavy flashlights and went down to the basement with him to investigate. But when they reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement was completely empty. The narrator explained that the intruder could have easily escaped through the back exit door in the upstairs costume room, which was used for unloading delivery trucks. They rushed back upstairs to the security office. Ashley began speeding through the camera footage of the past hour. They saw the narrator walking back and forth, but they did not see anyone else entering the building. However, the problem was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside the basement or the costume storage room itself. Even though he was terrified, the narrator still had a job to finish. He tried to convince himself that maybe it was just a harmless Halloween prank, and the person had already left. He walked back to the costume storage room and descended the basement steps to grab the box of costumes he had left behind. He picked up the heavy box and made it halfway to the stairs when he suddenly froze. He heard a very faint, distinct sound. It was the sound of a thin plastic bag being gently crumpled in the dark corner behind the metal shelf. He did not want to wait around to see who or what was making that sound. He hauled the heavy box up the stairs as fast as he could, dropped it onto the floor of the costume room, and walked back to the basement door to turn off the light. But before he reached for the switch, he looked down the dark staircase one last time. Standing right at the bottom of the stairs, looking straight up at him, was the person in the white robe. But this time, they were not wearing the monster mask. The narrator was staring directly at a strange man, with a wide, unnatural smile plastered across his face. The narrator slammed the basement door shut and ran screaming toward the front of the store, calling for help. Ashley, Kyle, and Maria ran back to the costume room with him. But by the time they got there, both the basement door and the heavy metal delivery door leading to the outside alley were swinging wide open. The smiling man was gone. They checked the single outdoor camera that pointed at the delivery area, but it had failed to capture the intruder's escape. To this day, the narrator does not know if the man was just a trespasser playing a terrifying prank, or a dangerous criminal waiting in the dark to do something far worse. That brings us to our second story, which took place several years ago during a windy, overcast late October afternoon. The narrator of this story was around 10 or 11 years old at the time. He lived in a large corner house that sat right next to a quiet sidewalk. This sidewalk led directly into a short, isolated, dead-end street that only contained two other houses. One of those houses was owned by an old, laid-back couple who rarely paid attention to anything happening outside. The house across from them was a small, run-down, disheveled property. The yard was overgrown with weeds, the paint was peeling, and the owner of the home was almost never seen coming outside. Because the neighborhood was so quiet and isolated, the narrator and his two best friends, Liam and Billy, were able to play outside as loudly as they wanted without worrying about bothering any neighbors. On this particular afternoon, The ground was covered in a thick blanket of dry autumn leaves. Since the narrator had the largest yard, the three boys spent hours raking all the leaves from the property into one massive towering pile right next to the sidewalk. They loved to wrestle in the leaves, pretending they were professional WWE superstars competing in a high-stakes match. After wrestling around for about half an hour, the boys got tired and decided to head inside the house to grab some snacks and play video games. They spent a couple of hours inside, but as the sun began to set, they decided they wanted to go back out for a nighttime wrestling match in the giant leaf pile. When they stepped back outside, it was almost completely dark. The only source of light was a single, dim street lamp standing at the entrance of the dead-end street, which cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. As they walked up to their leaf pile, they noticed something strange right away. The pile looked significantly smaller and flatter than it had when they went inside. They figured the wind must have blown some of the leaves away, so they grabbed their rakes and started gathering them back up. As Liam was raking near the edge of the pile, his rake caught on something heavy. He looked down and noticed a long, oddly shaped mound of leaves sitting a few feet away from their main pile. Liam tried to rake the leaves off the mound, but he seemed to be having a lot of trouble moving them. He called out to the other two boys, telling them that there was something solid hidden underneath the leaves. The three of them walked over and began brushing the dry leaves away with their hands. Suddenly, all three of them screamed and jumped backward in absolute terror. Lying directly under the leaves was the body of a grown man. They stood there in the dim light of the street lamp, staring at the motionless figure on the ground. They did not know whether to run inside or laugh, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate early Halloween prank. The man's face was completely covered by a thick layer of leaves. Liam and the narrator were too terrified to get closer, so they dared Billy to go over and uncover the man's face. Billy walked up slowly, looking back at his friends with a nervous expression. He reached out with his foot and began lightly kicking the leaves away from the head of the body. But as he kicked, he noticed something strange. The body did not feel like a real human. It felt hollow and hard under his shoe. He kicked more leaves away and realized that there was no face or head at all. It was a fake plastic mannequin body that someone had deliberately placed under the leaves while they were inside the house. But the terrifying question of who had placed the fake body there was answered almost immediately. As they stood there looking at the mannequin, the narrator noticed a sudden movement in the thick bushes directly behind the leaf pile. They looked closer and saw a figure crouching in the dark branches. They yelled out that they could see him. A man stepped out of the bushes, laughing hysterically. He looked to be around 60 years old, with large bulging eyes, crooked teeth, and a very disheveled appearance. He was breathing incredibly heavily as he walked toward them. He told the boys that he had planted the fake body there as a joke, because he always watched them playing in the leaves from his window, and he thought it would be funny to give them a good scare. The narrator felt an immediate wave of intense dread. The way the man smiled and proudly admitted to always watching them from the dark made his stomach churn. Liam tried to be polite and laugh it off, but the narrator knew something was deeply wrong with this man. He grabbed his friends' arms and told them they needed to go back inside immediately. They left the laughing man standing alone in the dark yard and ran back into the house. The narrator immediately told his father what had happened. His father looked concerned, grabbed a flashlight, and marched outside to investigate. But by the time he reached the yard, both the creepy man and the plastic mannequin were completely gone. The boys spent the rest of the night playing video games inside, all of them agreeing that the neighbor was an absolute freak. Eventually, Liam and Billy went home, and the narrator headed to his bedroom to get ready for sleep. He had his bedroom window open slightly, as he always did, to let the cool, refreshing October breeze flow into his room. He was lying in bed, watching television, when he suddenly heard a low, raspy man's voice speaking from right outside his open window. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked toward the window, but the screen was dark, and he could not see who was standing in the shadows of the yard. The raspy voice whispered into the room, saying that he did not mean to creep the narrator out earlier. The voice went on to say that he lived in the rundown, disheveled house across the street, and that he just really liked watching the kids play outside in the leaves. The narrator sat in his bed, completely paralyzed by fear, staring at the dark window. Suddenly, the familiar, terrifying face of the older man emerged from the darkness, illuminated by the dim glow of the television screen. The man reached his arm through the open window, pushed the screen upward with force, and began trying to climb through the narrow window frame into the bedroom. When he realized his body was too large to squeeze through easily, he began reaching his long, dirty arm into the room, desperately clawing at the air, trying to grab the narrator. The narrator let out a blood-curdling scream for his father and bolted out of his bed. He ran down the hallway, burst into his parents' bedroom, and dragged his father out of bed, crying hysterically. He led his father back to his bedroom, but by the time they reached the window, the man had already disappeared back into the darkness. The narrator pointed frantically toward the rundown house across the street and told his father that the man lived there. His father was absolutely furious and terrified for his son's safety. He marched across the street to the disheveled house and began pounding violently on the front door, demanding that the man come out. But no one answered. He immediately called the police. Within minutes, several police cruisers arrived at the scene with their lights flashing. They walked up to the front door with the narrator's father and began knocking again. This time, the door slowly opened and the creepy older man stepped out onto the porch. The police officers and the narrator's father immediately recognized the signs that the man was heavily under the influence of a powerful substance, which they later suspected was crystal meth. The narrator stood near the edge of the property and looked past the man into the open doorway. The inside of the house was an absolute pigsty, filled with piles of garbage, dirty clothes, and rotting food. It turned out that for all those years the neighborhood kids had been playing outside. They had been completely unaware that a dangerous, drug-addled stalker was living just feet away in that decaying house, watching their every move from the shadows. This brings us to our third and final story, which takes place in a rural part of New Jersey during a recent autumn. The narrator of this story had recently met a girl named Nikki at a party about a month prior. They had been talking and hanging out about once a week, and they were really hitting it off. Nikki was a huge fan of autumn activities, and she really wanted to go do something festive for October. The narrator came up with the idea that they should go apple picking at an orchard. Nikki loved the idea, so they hopped into his car and began driving out of the crowded suburbs toward the more rural, open parts of the state. They were about 20 minutes away from their destination, driving down a scenic 2-lane road, surrounded by dense woods and farm fields. There was almost no traffic on the road. As they drove, they passed what appeared to be an old, rustic apple orchard. The narrator noticed a narrow dirt road leading up to a small, poorly maintained wooden farmhouse. But as they looked closer, they noticed there were no cars parked anywhere, no people walking around, and not even a small farm stand where customers would go to pay. The property looked completely abandoned. The wooden farmhouse was in terrible shape, with boards missing and weeds growing high up against the walls. It looked like nobody had lived there for a very long time. As they slowly drove past, Nikki admitted that the property gave her a really bad vibe and made her feel uncomfortable. The narrator agreed, so they decided to keep driving toward their original destination. However, when they finally arrived at the orchard they had planned to visit, they were extremely disappointed. There was a large wooden closed sign hanging from the entry stand, and the entire property was completely devoid of life. They sat in the car, trying to figure out what to do next. The narrator turned to Nikki and suggested that they go back to the first abandoned orchard they had passed. He argued that since it was abandoned, they could just go in, pick some apples, and have the entire beautiful property completely to themselves. Nikki was very hesitant at first, remembering the creepy feeling the property had given her. But the narrator eventually managed to convince her, promising that it would be a fun little adventure. He drove them back down the scenic road, turned onto the narrow dirt path, and found a low-key spot to park his car on a patch of tall grass near the tree line, hidden from the main road. They stepped out of the car, and the sound of dry autumn leaves crushing under their feet echoed through the quiet air. They walked up to a low wooden fence and hopped over it with ease. Once they were inside, They felt a sense of relief because they were immediately hidden from view by the long, symmetrical rows of thick apple trees. However, the grass between the trees was incredibly tall, reaching all the way up to their shins, making it difficult to walk without making a lot of noise. They began walking down one of the rows, carrying plastic bags they had brought from the car. They searched the branches for the best apples they could find, though there were not very many left on the trees. The narrator felt a rush of excitement from doing something they were not supposed to be doing, and he decided to have some fun with it. He grabbed a couple of apples, tossed them high into the air, and began pretending he was going to throw them at Nicky. Nicky laughed, screamed, and ran away down the row of trees, telling him to stop. She darted through a gap in the thick branches to get to an adjacent row. When the narrator reached the other side, he could no longer see her. He called out, asking where she had gone. Her voice called back from a few rows over, laughing and saying that she was going to pick her own apples now. The narrator laughed and apologized, promising that he would stop throwing them. He began walking through the rows of trees to find her, but she did not answer him again. He spent a few minutes searching the area in silence. Suddenly, a large apple landed with a loud thud on the ground right in front of him, followed closely by another one, landing a few feet away. He figured Nicky was playing a game and throwing them back at him. He called out for her to stop, worried about getting hit in the face. He quickly pushed his way through a thick cluster of branches to get to the next row, looking left and right to see if she was hiding nearby. He did not see her, so he stepped through another row. He looked to his left, and his heart instantly leaped into his throat. Standing in the very center of the row, only about 5 trees away from him, was a young man. He looked to be around 18 or 19 years old, with long, shoulder-length black hair. He was standing completely still, wearing a slight mocking smirk on his face, and he was staring directly at the narrator. The narrator was completely frozen for a second, overwhelmed by a sudden, intense feeling of danger. The young man did not move a single muscle. He just kept staring with that creepy smile. The narrator slowly backed away, turned, and squeezed as fast as he could through the thick branches into the next row, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the stranger. As he was moving through the trees, his phone suddenly began vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Nicky's name on the screen. He answered it immediately and whispered into the receiver, asking where she was. Nicky's voice was trembling, and she sounded like she was in a state of pure panic. She whispered that a creepy guy with long black hair was following her through the orchard. She had tried to speak to him, but he refused to say a word, and she was terrified that he was going to hurt her. The narrator realized with horror that they were both being stalked by the same person. He told Nicky to run as fast as she could back to the car. He sprinted through the rows of trees, ignoring the branches scratching at his face, and made it back to the edge of the woods. Nicky was already there, waiting by the passenger side door, shaking with fear. They stopped for a brief second to catch their breath, but before they could even speak, Nicky let out a terrified scream and pointed toward the orchard. The narrator looked back and saw the young man with the long black hair standing just inside the tree line. He was standing half hidden behind the trunk of a large apple tree, with only half of his face and body visible, coldly watching them from the shadows. The narrator grabbed the door handle, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. He slammed the car into reverse, executed a rapid 3-point turn on the grass, and sped down the dirt road past the decaying wooden farmhouse, leaving the smiling stranger behind in the dust. As they drove down the main road, they were both incredibly shaken up. A few miles away, they passed a small, bustling fruit stand on the side of the road with a few local workers standing outside. Since they had dropped their plastic bags of apples in the orchard during their escape, they decided to pull over and buy some fruit there just to calm their nerves. While they were picking out some apples and fresh berries, the narrator decided to strike up a conversation with the 2 women working behind the counter. He casually asked them about the old abandoned apple orchard located just a few miles down the road. The moment he asked, the expression on the women's faces changed from friendly smiles to pure, pale horror. One of the women looked at him with wide eyes and warned him that nobody should ever go anywhere near that property. The narrator asked why, and the woman explained the dark history of the place. She revealed that a few years ago, the owner's teenage son had brutally murdered his girlfriend on the property, and then vanished without a trace. Her body had been discovered by police hidden in the dense forest bordering the orchard. The father still technically owned the land, but he was completely devastated, rarely ever returned to the property, and refused to cooperate with the ongoing police investigation. The narrator and Nikki stood there in absolute shock. The narrator asked the women if they could describe the missing son. The women admitted that they had never personally seen him, but they knew the police were still actively searching for him. The narrator confessed to the women that they had just been inside the orchard, and that a creepy young man with long black hair had been stalking them through the trees. The two women gasped and told them that they were incredibly lucky to have gotten out of there when they did. They gently scolded the couple for trespassing on such a dangerous property and urged them to contact the authorities immediately. One of the women grabbed her phone and said she was going to call the local police to report the sighting herself. During the entire drive home, Nikki kept talking about how terrifying the encounter was, but her words seemed to go in one ear and out the other for the narrator. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the road ahead, with a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that they had just come face to face with an active, wanted murderer who was using his family's abandoned orchard as a hiding place. He still gets chills to this day, wondering if that young man with the long black hair is still crouching in the shadows of those apple trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors to wander in. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I will choose to be anonymous with this, because it is pretty embarrassing to admit how naive I was, and also putting my real name out there tied to this is likely a horrible idea. There was a Craigslist ad posted back in the spring of 2017 by a guy named Jackson. He was advertising free lodging for a young woman who would watch over his house and do some basic cleaning. He pitched it as basically being an au pair or a nanny, but without actually having to watch any children. I will just be completely honest with you and say that I had kind of lost the will to do much of anything when I was 21 years old. I had absolutely zero relationship with my parents or my sister at that point, and I only had a handful of friends in the entire world who I actually trusted. I had dropped out of college during my very first year, which was a huge part of the reason why my parents absolutely hated me for a while. Because of that, I was working a completely dead-end job at a local vape shop. I like to refer to this specific period of my life as my attitude era, and when I saw Jackson's Craigslist ad, it really caught my attention. It had about 10 pictures of his house attached to the post. It looked like a very modest, middle-class house. It was slightly old-fashioned, honestly, but I was actually really into that aesthetic. The pictures were not even what got my attention the most, though. It was the fact that free living was being offered for a nanny-type position with absolutely no background check required. I did not even bother to ask my family or my friends for their opinion on this post before I just made up my mind to reply to it. Like I said, I was not exactly on speaking terms with my parents or my sister at the time, so their advice did not matter to me. Anyway, I texted the phone number listed on the ad, and this Jackson guy responded within just a few minutes. I expressed my interest in the listing and asked some very basic questions about the arrangement. He had an answer to absolutely everything, and his responses honestly made me feel even more interested. But he asked me pretty early on in the conversation what my gender was. When I told him that I was female, it almost seemed as though his text messages got much longer and more enthusiastic. I honestly did not care at the time. I figured most people tend to prefer having a female housekeeper or a female nanny in their home, because it feels safer. Anyway, I was still incredibly interested in the offer. I was willing to do almost anything that got me out of my parents' house. He said he would not be home most of the time during the day because of his work, but he wanted to come home to a clean house, and he also mentioned that he would not mind coming home to a hot-cooked meal from time to time after a long shift. Honestly, I was totally cool with that too. If it meant free housing, then hell yeah, I would happily cook some food. It beat standing in the wage cage at the vape shop all day long, breathing in artificial fruit vapors. Plus, he also said he would pay for all of the groceries. It was sounding almost too good to be true. He suggested that I come by later that day to check the place out and see if it was a good fit. I said okay. A few hours later, I was on my way in my crappy little Honda Civic to the guy's house. It was in a perfectly normal side of town. The block actually seemed pretty calm and peaceful. The neighboring houses had beautiful flowers and cute decorations outside, suggesting that the neighbors were completely normal people too. That was a really good start, I thought. I went up to the front door to ring the bell, and when the door opened, I was greeted by a man who was much larger and honestly much older than I had pictured in my head. I had pictured this regular 45-year-old dad-looking guy. Instead, it was a man who looked to be maybe 60 years old. He was easily 6 feet tall, had a thick gray beard, and was a little overweight. He greeted me with a massive smile and immediately went in for a hug, even though we had just met. And honestly, the amount that he laughed and smiled made me feel pretty at ease. He showed me all around the house. It was a 2-story house. The first floor was your basic kitchen, dining room, and living room setup. Then the upstairs had 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. He only showed me the guest room that I would be using, and the bathroom upstairs though. The other doors stayed completely closed. He said if I ever needed to use the office across the hall, I was welcome to. Down the hall was his private bedroom and another room that he did not explain at all. I was a bit surprised to hear that there was only 1 bathroom for the whole house. Then there was the basement. He said it was unfinished, and that he does not use it for anything other than working out and doing laundry. That was the end of the tour. He did not show me the backyard that day. I told him I wanted the job, and he told me I was hired on the spot. 2 days later, I came back with all of my stuff. I told my parents I got an apartment when they asked where I was going. I did not explain anything more to them because I wanted to avoid the drama. The very first night there was when I noticed the cameras. No, they were not hidden. At least, I do not think they were supposed to be hidden. They were just small black security cameras mounted up in the corners of the living room and the kitchen. It made perfectly normal sense to me at first. He was letting basically a complete stranger live in his house. It was not that crazy that he would want some security. Still, I really wish he had mentioned them to me beforehand. That was the first time I felt even slightly weird about the situation. If you cannot tell, I really wanted this to work out, so I was willing to ignore the red flags. That night, when I went to bed, I noticed how much noisier the house felt than when we toured it. I could hear the old wood floors creaking every once in a while. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere downstairs. I checked my phone, and it was around 1:30 in the morning. Again, I came up with a perfectly logical reason for this in my head. When you are laying in complete silence trying to sleep, you pick up on far more sounds than you would when you are occupied by something during the day. Plus, every old house makes sounds like that as it settles. The next morning, he was already gone, just like he said he would be. He had left a note on the counter with a list of things he wanted done. It was normal stuff. He wanted me to do his laundry, vacuum the floors, wipe down the kitchen counters, and stuff like that. I tried to just focus on the positive fact that I was not standing behind a vape counter all day anymore. I did his laundry first, then I cleaned the floors and wiped everything down until it was spotless. After that, I went back upstairs and started setting up the bedroom more like my own personal space. I unpacked my clothes, set up my laptop on a small desk, and put a few of my personal things around just to make it feel less temporary. I remember thinking that maybe this could actually work out. I was actually being quite positive. After I finished everything, I just relaxed for a while and watched YouTube videos on my laptop. Not hearing my parents yelling downstairs, or having one of them burst through my bedroom door, barking orders at me, was a breath of fresh air. The first week actually went pretty normally. At night when he got home, we would talk a little bit, mostly about basic stuff. It never really got deep. He asked about where I grew up, what I wanted to do eventually in life, and stuff like that. I cooked dinner a few nights in a row and he seemed to really appreciate it. I started thinking maybe I just overreacted about the cameras and the weird feelings. But it did not all stay happy and peachy for long. One night I made pasta with chicken and some vegetables. I tried my absolute best, But I am not some housewife type star chef. I was just some young angsty goth girl. When he got home, he looked tired and irritated. He took one bite of the food and his whole face changed. He said it tasted completely bland. I said sorry and offered to add some seasoning or make something else, but he just kind of snapped. He said something like, if I was going to be living there for free, the least I could do was learn how to cook something edible. He pushed the plate away and stood up. Then he told me to clean up the mess I made in his kitchen before he walked away towards bedroom. That caught me completely off guard. It was not even just what he said. It was how fast his personality seemed to change. He had seemed so easygoing before that. I cleaned everything up quietly and hoped that he had just had a bad day at work and nothing more. Everyone has bad days. The next morning, I actually apologized to him. I did not even really think I did anything wrong, but I wanted to keep things smooth and keep my free room. I told him I was sorry about dinner and I would try harder. He just laughed like it was nothing. Then he said something that made everything extremely weird. He said maybe I could make it up to him by cleaning the house in my underwear that day. He said it with a smile, like it was supposed to be a joke. I remember just kind of freezing for a second, because I did not know how to respond to that. I told him I was not comfortable with that, to put it lightly. He just laughed again and said he was joking and told me to relax, and then he went to bed. I remember standing there after he left feeling really unsettled. It was the first time I really thought maybe there was something off about him beyond just being moody. That was the first time I texted one of my close friends about what was going on. I told her about the living situation and what he had just said to me. She immediately told me I was insane for staying there. She told me to leave as soon as possible. I did not want to, though. As weird as it was getting, I still felt like I had more control over my life there than I did living with my parents. Going back there felt like failing again. The next Monday, I was leaving the house to go buy groceries with some money he had left for me. As I was driving down the street, a car behind me started laying on the horn. I thought I did something wrong while driving, but the car kept following me closely. I pulled over to the side of the road because I started getting scared that something was really wrong. The car pulled up right behind me, and a girl got out. She looked to be around my age. She walked up to my window and asked if I was currently living at that house. When I said yes, she immediately told me I needed to stay away from that man. Apparently, Jackson was not even his real name. She said she was the girl who had the exact same living arrangement before me. She told me she eventually realized he had cameras watching her constantly. She said she started noticing he knew things about her that he should not know. She said when she tried to leave, he made it very difficult and kept asking questions about where she was going and when she was coming back. Then, she told me one night, she woke up and saw him slowly leaving her bedroom in the dark. That part made me physically sick to my stomach. Then she told me the worst part of all. She said he did not even have a job. She said he lied about going to work every day, and she eventually realized he was actually still somewhere inside the house most days, hiding. I just sat there trying to process it. Every little weird thing suddenly started making complete sense. I asked her how I could leave without causing any major problems. She told me to act completely normal, to start slowly taking my most important things out of the house so he would not notice. She said when I leave, I should make it look like I was just running normal errands. And she told me not to confront him, and not to let him know I knew anything at all. After she left, I just sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going back to the house. When I walked back into the house, it felt completely different. I felt like I was being watched even more than before. That night, I checked the room carefully like she suggested. She was right. After a few minutes of looking around, I noticed something small on the top shelf of the closet. It was pushed away into the corner. When I moved a cardboard box, I saw a tiny black camera lens pointing outward through a small drilled hole in the wood. I just slowly put the box back like I did not see it. Needless to say, I did not sleep at all that night. I looked at the darkness of the room, wondering what I had gotten myself into. And honestly, I am glad I did not fall asleep that night, because at some random crazy hour in the middle of the night, I heard my bedroom door creak open. I flipped onto my side and looked at the door. It was Jackson. He noticed me look at him, and he quickly apologized for waking me and closed the door. What the actual hell was that weirdo planning on doing? I needed to get out of there immediately. The next morning, I started my plan. Every single day, I would bring one small, unassuming bag of my stuff to my car. Just normal things and nothing too obvious. 3 days later, I left while he was supposedly at work, and I never came back. Though, if what that girl told me was true, who knows where he actually was? Maybe he was in the house somewhere watching me pack. He texted me later that day asking where I was. I told him I decided to move back home and thanked him for the opportunity. He kept texting, asking why, and saying I should at least come talk to him in person to say goodbye. I never responded again. About a week later, I noticed something that still bothers me to this day. I got an email notification saying someone had tried to log into one of my old online accounts. The login attempt was from the exact same town his house was in. I changed all of my passwords after that. I do not know what his real intentions were, and honestly, I do not want to know. Nothing technically happened to me, but I really believe if I had stayed there any longer, something eventually would have. If you ever see deals like that offering free housing from strangers online, just remember that nothing like that is ever really free. And it turns out, this kind of creepy invasion of privacy does not just happen when you are the one looking for a place to live. Sometimes, it happens when you invite someone into your own home to help you out. I hired her sometime around the beginning of last fall. I work incredibly long hours and live completely alone in a 2-floor house I bought a couple of years ago. It is pretty small, and yet it is still more space than I really need. I started realizing I was falling way behind on keeping the place clean. No matter how much I told myself I would get to cleaning the house on the weekend, I never seemed to be able to find the time or energy. One night after a long shift at work, I was just scrolling through Craigslist and other similar sites, and I saw a listing for house cleaning services. It was just a simple post saying independent cleaner, cash only, flexible schedule. I figured, why not? Maybe this was exactly what I needed to get my life back in order. I sent an email, and she responded the very next morning. She said she usually cleaned apartments, but she was totally fine doing houses too. We agreed on a day she could come by while I was at work. She asked a few normal questions, like how big the house was and if I had any pets. I told her no pets, relatively small house, and that I lived alone. Looking back, I really wish I had not mentioned that last part so casually. She came the following Thursday. I met her quickly in the morning before leaving for work, and yes, before you ask, I hid anything of value in my lockable office closet before leaving. She looked to be maybe 38 years old. She seemed very quiet. She did not really make eye contact much with me, but I just figured she was shy. I showed her around the house quickly, pointing out all the rooms I wanted her to clean upstairs and downstairs. I told her she did not need to worry about my office room. She asked where I usually keep the cleaning supplies, and I showed her the laundry room. She asked if she could come regularly every couple of weeks. I said maybe, because I wanted to see how this first time went before committing to anything. Before I left, she asked what time I usually got home from work. I told her around 6 or sometimes closer to 7, depending on traffic. At the time, that did not seem weird to me at all, since she probably just wanted to make sure she was not still there when I got back. When I got home that night, the place honestly looked great. The floors and counters were shiny, and everything smelled fresh and clean. I paid her what we agreed and she left. Nothing seemed wrong. For about a week, everything was good. Then, it started maybe 6 nights later. I woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning. I am not a great sleeper, so waking up in the night was not unusual for me. What was unusual was that I thought I heard a soft thump coming from downstairs. It sounded like maybe something settling or one of those random house noises you hear at night. Put simply, I ignored it, as most people do when they hear those sounds. A couple of nights later, I woke up again, and this time I heard what sounded like a cabinet door slowly closing in the kitchen. Again, I just assumed I was half asleep and imagining things. I did not go downstairs to check. I definitely was not going to go walk around a dark house at 3 in the morning over something that was probably just my imagination. I really wish I did, though. Over the next week, I started noticing small things that felt slightly off, but not enough to really alarm me. One morning, a kitchen cabinet was open a few inches. I figured maybe I had left it that way the night before. Another time, a chair at my dining room table seemed pulled out slightly. Again, I assumed I must have done it without thinking. One Saturday morning, I noticed the downstairs bathroom hand towel felt damp. Stuff like that kept happening. Small things that you could always explain away if you want to. Then the nighttime sounds kept happening, always soft enough to explain away. Once it sounded like a single slow footstep downstairs, but I convinced myself it was probably the wood floors adjusting to the temperature change. I started sleeping with my bedroom door shut instead of cracked open like I usually did. I did not really want to admit I was getting uneasy, but I definitely was. One night, I woke up and was almost sure I heard movement right outside my bedroom door, like weight being shifted on the floorboards. I still did not get up. I just stared at my door in the dark, waiting to see if the handle would move. Yes, I was starting to get that paranoid, but nothing happened, and eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I felt stupid for even being scared. I checked the house, and everything looked completely normal. Around this time, I texted the cleaner again about coming back since, overall, she did a good job, and I figured maybe I was just stressed out from work. She came again on another weekday while I was at work. It was the same routine. I left the back door unlocked for her. When I got home, everything looked clean again. She asked if I wanted to schedule something regular. I told her maybe once a month. Anything more than that seemed like a waste of money to me. About a week after that second cleaning, I started noticing food seemed to be disappearing slightly faster than it should. At one point, I thought I was losing my mind, swearing to myself that there was at least one more yogurt cup in the fridge the previous night, and now it was completely gone. Bread's slices seemed lower than I remembered too. I was still trying to explain these things away though. But one morning, I found a glass in the sink that I was almost positive I had not used. I lived alone and was single at the time, so there really was no anyone else it could have been. At one point, I wondered if maybe I was doing these things while half asleep and not remembering them. I even Googled stuff about sleepwalking to see if that was a possibility. Things really changed one night when I woke up and clearly heard slow footsteps downstairs. I know what footsteps sound like compared to house settling noises. These were distinct steps. I grabbed my phone and stopped to listen for a second. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard what sounded like something lightly bumping into a wall. I did not go downstairs. I know some people might think that sounds stupid, but fear really does make you freeze sometimes instead of act. Or maybe I was picking flight over fight before even confronting the situation. I just stayed in bed, sitting up for half an hour, not hearing anything again, and finally convincing myself it was nothing. And looking back, I look at myself as a coward for that. Morning came, and that day I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I even checked my basement. Even though I never heard anything coming from down there, it was completely clear. A few days later, I noticed something that really bothered me. In my kitchen junk drawer, where I keep random things like batteries and takeout menus, I also kept 2 spare house keys on a small ring. One of them was completely gone. I got goosebumps when I considered the obvious possibility, but I kept telling myself that it was not possible. I searched the entire house, but I could not find the key anywhere. The cleaner had been alone in the house twice for several hours each time. I started locking my bedroom door at night after that. About 4 nights later, I decided to test something. I left for work like normal in the morning, but after driving just a few blocks, I circled back and parked on the next street over. I walked back quietly and went in through my back door. I stayed upstairs and just waited in silence. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, I heard something. It was the sound of my front door unlocking. I heard very soft footsteps come inside. I moved to where I could see part of the downstairs through the stair railing. It looked like her, the cleaner. She just walked in like she lived there. She did not even have any cleaning supplies with her. She went straight into my kitchen, opened the fridge, took out a drink, and sat down at my dining table. She sat there quietly for a few minutes. Then she walked slowly around my living room, looking at things. She picked up a framed photo of me and my brother and just stared at it. Then she walked toward the stairs. I backed up as quietly as I could into my bedroom and shut the door without making any noise. I honestly did not know what to do. I did not want her to know I was home yet. After maybe a minute, I heard her walk halfway up the stairs and then stop. I could see her shadow under my door. She just stood there, not moving, as if she knew I was at the door. It felt like at least a full minute of absolute silence. With my mind racing, I decided it was now or never to confront her. I flung the door open, and I was not expecting her to actually already be standing mere feet away from the door, already looking at it, and now looking directly at me. But I quickly realized now that I had a closer look, it was not the same lady. It was another Hispanic lady, yes, but her build, hair, and face were all completely different. There was something so bone-chilling about her face. She had this blank, nearly angry, hateful look on her face. I did not say anything, and neither did she. We just stood there staring at each other for a few seconds before she slowly turned around and walked back down the stairs like absolutely nothing had happened. I heard my front door open and close a few seconds later. My heart was pounding, and I was shaking uncontrollably. I think I was genuinely too nervous and shook to move or say a single word. I waited maybe 5 minutes before even moving. Dialing 911 was almost difficult with how shaky my fingers were. The police came, and I explained everything to them. I explained that there were 2 different women involved. I gave them the phone number and email of the original cleaning lady and any other info I could possibly provide. The original cleaning lady stopped responding completely after that day. I replaced every single lock in the house that same day. Like literally right after the cops left, I went straight to the hardware store. What still bothers me is the officer asking me if I had given anyone else a key, to which I told him no. He just said that sometimes people like that do not work alone, and they use cleaners to scout houses and copy keys. I never hired another cleaner again. It is crazy to think that 2008 was almost 20 years ago, but here we are. For anybody who is too young to remember, the early 2000s were sort of like the Wild West for the internet in many ways. Back in 2008, I was in my early 20s, and honestly, I was a bit reckless. I was way too trusting, and I was the king of saying things like, "That could never happen to me." I just never really had that sense of urgency or anxiety that other people had. That is until one spring evening when I experienced for myself firsthand that downright evil individuals really do exist in this world. Facebook had just started to blow up, but most people I knew were still rocking MySpace. Social media was a thing, but not like it is today. We had all heard horror stories about the internet, but nobody I knew actually cared. Or more accurately, we were all just incredibly ignorant. I bring all this up because perhaps the most insane thing about the internet at the time was a little website called Craigslist. Now, I know Craigslist is still around today, but it is nothing compared to what it was back in the early 2000s. We did not have websites like Facebook Marketplace, so if you wanted to buy or sell something, you went straight to Craigslist. We could find and purchase anything from small trinkets to vehicles and everything in between. You could even find work or odd jobs for some extra cash. I had heard from friends who used Craigslist all the time that it was the greatest website ever. They absolutely swore by it. I never had any interest in visiting the website until my life started to unravel a bit in the spring of 2008. I was living with my girlfriend, and with almost no notice at all, she dumped me and threw me out of the house. Thankfully, I was not living on the street or anything like that, because I had great friends who would let me crash at their place. I spent the immediate days after the breakup trying to find my own apartment, but it was proving harder than I thought on my $7 an hour salary. One of my friends, whom I had previously mentioned, who swore by Craigslist, told me to check it out for possible houses or even rooms for rent. I may have been reckless and ignorant, but surprisingly that was a hard pass for me. I do not know why. I just did not love the idea of renting a room from a stranger for some reason. However, I did start looking for furniture and items to eventually fill my place whenever I actually found a place to fill, since my ex-girlfriend kept absolutely everything after the breakup. At first, it was like a treasure chest of goods. I could finally see why people loved Craigslist so much. I literally could find anything I needed. I was finding incredible deals left and right. My buddy had a massive garage that he allowed me to store my recently purchased furniture in until I found my own place. One afternoon, I was looking for a love seat or a small couch to store in the garage. I found a post from a guy named Keith, who was selling a whole sectional sofa for $45. He had a picture with the posting, and it was a smaller sectional sofa that could easily fit in most living rooms. Not to mention, it looked like it was in great shape. The price seemed way too good to be true, but as I said, I was ignorant, and I just saw a cool couch and a very low price tag. I messaged Keith, and to my surprise he messaged me back almost right away and told me the couch was still available. He seemed incredibly friendly and trustworthy. Well, as trustworthy as anyone can be over messaging on the internet. He told me that he had gotten a new job in another state, and he was just trying to sell his stuff quickly, hence the incredibly low price. The reason seemed good enough to me, so we exchanged numbers and set up a time to meet that evening. It was a meetup that would go on to traumatize me for years, and open my eyes to the horror that exists even in our own backyards. I pulled up to the house around 9 p.m. that night. That was probably a massive red flag for most people, but not for me at the time. He told me he had some other work arrangement, so he could not meet until that time. It did not seem weird to me. The house was completely dark, and not just because it was dark outside. Everything looked desolate. It was a very run-down street with almost no street lamps working. There were several houses on the block, and they were all just as dark and decrepit as Keith's house. I tried calling Keith several times with the number he gave me, but I just kept getting one of those automated responses, saying that the number is no longer in service. The call cannot be completed. Just as I was about to drive away and forget about the couch, my phone buzzed. It was a weird number with a completely different area code. I answered, and I was greeted with a friendly and somewhat unnerving voice. His voice was deep and almost erratic. He called me fella and started apologizing about the phone business. He told me that he broke his cell phone a little while ago, and he was calling me on his work phone instead. I was definitely a little weirded out, but not scared or uneasy yet. I was honestly more annoyed than anything else. I realize hindsight is 20/20, but at the time when you are in those kinds of situations, your brain is just kind of working differently. I was not thinking about the worst case scenario. I was just thinking about getting that cheap couch. He told me to meet him around the back side of the residence, and he would unlock the back door for me. I did not even question it for 1 second. I made my way to the back of the house, and I could not believe that it was still so dark. I figured this guy would at least turn on some kind of light for me. I got to the back door and just stood there for a moment. I did not know if he just wanted me to walk inside, or if he was coming outside to get me. I decided to call him again on what he said was his work cell. Instead of hearing the ring in my ear, I heard a generic ringtone coming from behind me. Not inside the house, but from the thick bushes in the backyard. I hate to even say this, but this is the first time I finally felt some kind of sinking, feeling that something might not be right. Keith suddenly ran out from the bushes, waving his ringing flip phone in the air, and with that strange, frantic voice, he told me that he was just getting rid of some old food, and he was coming out to greet me. He said that he did not mean to alarm me. He claimed that he liked to feed the squirrels and whatever other animals lived in those bushes. I told him it was fine, and that I just wanted to see the couch so I could be on my way. In a very cheerful voice, he said, "Of course." He skipped by me, almost stumbling as he passed me. We got to the back door, and it looked like he was struggling to open it. When he told me to meet him in the back, I just assumed that he was going to be opening it from the inside of the house. I did not expect him to be trying to open the door from the outside. This was the first time I got a good look at Keith. At least as good a look as I could get in the extremely limited light. He was older, but not old. I would say maybe late 50s. He was really skinny and had long white hair that was pulled back in a nasty, greasy ponytail. Worst of all, he smelled strongly like a dirty ashtray full of old cigarette butts. He pulled away from the door a little bit and asked if I could help him get the door open. He said sometimes the door would stick, and he was embarrassed that he could not get it open himself. He told me to just use my shoulder and push the door as hard as I could. At this point, I knew something was wrong, but I was already in the moment, and I was just kind of going with the flow. I grabbed the doorknob and lowered my shoulder into the door. It did not stick at all. In fact, as I lowered my shoulder to push it open, someone from the other side opened the door. I had so much momentum now that I completely lost my balance and fell hard to the floor inside. When I hit the ground, I heard Keith yell, "Now!" In the dark room, two other people suddenly emerged from each side and held me down on the ground. I started to squirm and fight, but it did not matter. One of the guys holding me down was absolutely huge. Keith started to repeatedly kick my face. One of the worst parts of all this was the sheer darkness of the situation. I could not see anything at all, and that made everything feel so much worse and more terrifying. I could feel my body starting to get weak from Keith kicking me in the head. He told the other guy to grab the tape, and I heard the unmistakable sound of duct tape ripping. I could not even imagine what they planned on doing to me once they had me bound. What happened next is probably the closest thing to a miracle that has ever happened to me in my entire life. During the struggle of me falling and being held down, my phone in my pocket had accidentally dialed my friend, the friend that I had been living with since the breakup. The sounds of him yelling "hello" on the speaker were coming through the phone loud and clear. I decided to scream out, "I am in the back of the house. Come and help me." It was clearly a complete bluff. I was entirely alone, but I was not sure if these guys knew that. I was hopefully trying to scare them into thinking I had someone else waiting in the car for me. The big guy holding me down suddenly eased his grip and looked up at Keith, who had stopped kicking me for a brief second. That single second of hesitation was all I needed. I was able to violently free myself from their grip, and I ran out the back door and sprinted back to my car. I could hear them chasing right behind me, but I did not dare look back. I slammed my car door shut and locked it immediately before starting the engine. Just as I was peeling away from the curb, I saw the big guy clearly for the very first time. He was completely bald and had one of those patchy, unkempt beards. His eyes were the worst part of his appearance. They were dark and looked completely lifeless, like a shark's eyes. He was actively trying to open my car door, even as I was driving away. I just kept driving. I drove around for hours before I finally went back to my friend's house. I was terrified that somehow those guys were going to follow me, and I did not want them to know where I was staying. I called my friend back and told him everything that had just happened. I eventually called the authorities to report the incident, but it was too late. The Craigslist post was already deleted, and apparently, the cell phone number was some sort of prepaid track phone, and Keith had immediately ditched it. I gave the police the best description I could, but as far as I know, Keith and those two other guys are still out there in the world somewhere. What scares me every single time I think about that night is when I think about their actual intention. This was not just a simple robbery. They did not even ask for my wallet or my keys. He lured me in with a $45 deal. Whatever those monsters wanted, it was not just my money. It was something so much worse. I start going down a dark rabbit hole in my mind, thinking about what could have happened to me if I hadn't somehow escaped that dark room. As I wrote this story, I am well aware of the incredibly stupid choices I made along the way. I am just so thankful I am still here to tell it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I was 21 when this happened. The year was 2017. At the time, I was working part-time at a gas station that was located a few towns over from where I actually lived. It was not a permanent career choice for me. In fact, it was just one of those temporary jobs that I only planned to keep for a few months. I was just trying to pay my bills and save up some money until I finally figured out what I wanted to do next in my life. The daytime shifts at the gas station were usually pretty easy. They were mostly filled with ordinary tasks like ringing up snacks, sodas, and cigarettes. Occasionally, some people would come in to pay for their gas in cash, but it was mostly just normal, boring customer service. During the day, the job could be annoying, but it felt completely normal. The nights, however, were a completely different story. The night shifts dragged on forever. The entire place felt way too bright on the inside, while the outside world was pitch black. The contrast was always unsettling. It felt like being on a stage where anyone outside could see me, but I could not see them at all. To make matters worse, every customer who walked through the door after dark seemed just a little bit stranger than the last. On the night of this specific incident, I was working the closing shift entirely by myself. It is a night that I still think about all the time, even now, years later. The store was scheduled to close at midnight. The evening started out quiet, but everything changed around 9 or 10 at night. At that point, the landline phone on the counter started ringing. I answered it without thinking anything of it. It was a normal part of the job to get calls about store hours or gas prices. But the second I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear, I heard this incredibly weird voice. It was low and drawn out, like someone trying to sound like a killer in a horror movie. It reminded me right away of Ghostface from the movie Scream. It sounded really forced, almost like someone was using a cheap voice changer, or just doing a really bad impression. But even though it sounded fake, it was still very unsettling to hear when you are alone in a quiet store. The voice slowly asked if I was all alone in the store. I just stayed quiet for a second, trying to process if this was a joke. Then, I said something sarcastic like, "Yeah, you got me," and then I hung up the phone. I figured it had to be one of my friends messing with me. They knew I worked the late shift, and they were always looking for ways to play pranks. I immediately pulled out my cell phone and texted our group chat. I asked them which one of them was calling the store pretending to be a serial killer. They all found it funny and acted confused at first. One of them texted back asking what I was talking about. Another friend said he was at home playing video games. I assumed they were just lying to me, because that would have been the obvious response if they wanted to keep the prank going. I figured they wanted to see how long they could keep me on edge. About 10 minutes later, the landline phone rang again. I picked it up, and sure enough, it was that exact same fake horror movie voice. This time, the person on the other end asked why I had hung up on them. I was starting to get a little annoyed, so I once again sarcastically said, "All right, you got me. Very funny." But instead of laughing like a friend would, the voice let out this soft laugh that sounded weirdly real. It was not a playful chuckle. It was quiet, dry, and incredibly cold. And then the caller said, "I should not be rude to people who know where I am." I hung up the phone again, but this time I felt a little off. The sarcasm was gone. It was probably still a joke, but there was something about how calm and steady the person sounded that really got to me. I kept trying to shake the feeling off. Luckily, customers were still coming in at that point, which was enough to keep me distracted. People were getting gas, buying beer, and getting lottery tickets. But every single time the customer flow slowed down, I found myself staring at that phone. And then, it rang a third time around 10:40. I answered it, and I immediately regretted doing so. The voice did not even wait for me to speak. It just asked if the store always got this quiet this late at night. That question got under my skin more than I want to admit. I stood there, paralyzed, saying absolutely nothing, and then I slammed the phone back onto its cradle. After that, I texted my friends again. This time I was not being playful. I told them it was getting old and demanded to know who was doing it. Once again, they all denied it. I started messaging them one by one to see if I could catch someone in a lie. But the answers I got seemed too genuine. One of my friends was out with his girlfriend and even sent a quick photo of them at a restaurant. Another friend sent me a real-time picture of himself in his basement. Another was at a friend's house almost half an hour away. At that point, I started getting annoyed instead of scared. I thought maybe my friends had asked someone else to do it, someone whose voice I would not recognize. But the truth was, even though the caller never once said my name, he was saying things that perfectly matched what was happening in the store. He knew exactly how quiet it was. Around 11 o'clock, the calls started coming closer together. I decided I was done playing this game, so I stopped answering after the fifth call. The phone would ring, and I would just stand there, staring at the flashing red light on the receiver, letting it ring until it stopped on its own. But the problem was, a minute or two later, it would just start ringing again. This went on for about 15 minutes. The constant ringing in the empty store was driving me crazy. I started checking the security cameras more frequently. We had a few cameras positioned around the outside of the building and a few on the inside. The store sat entirely by itself off a country road that got pretty dead at night. There was a small patch of thick woods directly behind one side of the building, and an alleyway area where the garbage dumpster was located. The outside cameras were not great. They had massive blind spots, and the picture quality at night was incredibly grainy and dark. Still, I kept flipping through the camera channels on the monitor, half expecting to catch one of my friends crouched outside in the dark, laughing into their phone, but I did not see anyone out there. And then I started hearing little sounds outside. At first I told myself it was just the wind or the old building settling. I heard a faint tap somewhere on the exterior wall. Then I heard what sounded like a light scrape near the side of the building. A few moments later, there was a noise by the back door that sounded exactly like someone stepping on loose gravel. It got to a point where I could not dismiss it as nothing anymore. I texted the group chat again and told them to seriously stop because they were crossing the line. I even took a picture of the empty store from where I was standing and wrote that this was not funny anymore. They kept denying it. One of my friends actually called me from his normal phone number. I answered, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. I told him everything that was happening. He sounded genuinely confused and insisted he was not joking, nor was he involved in any prank. He told me that if I was really scared, I should just lock the front door early. I did not want to do that because my boss was very strict, and I did not want to get fired over what might just be me overreacting. Part of me still desperately wanted to believe I was making too much out of nothing. But then, at around 11:40, one last customer came into the store. I remember the exact sound of the front door chime opening because it made me jump. I looked up quickly and saw just a regular-looking guy walk in. He looked like he was in his late 20s or early 30s. There was nothing outwardly crazy or threatening about him. He was not dirty, and he was not dressed weirdly. He just had this completely blank expression on his face. He did not say hello, and he did not make eye contact. He just walked right past me and started moving through the aisles. I watched him on the security cameras, while trying to pretend like I was just doing my job. He took way too long for someone who ended up buying a single bag of chips. He kept slowly drifting from aisle to aisle, stopping and staring at the shelves. More than once, I saw the top half of his face appear just above the shelves as he looked toward the checkout counter. He was not looking in a casual way either. I felt like he was checking on me, monitoring my movements. I kept trying to rationalize it. I thought maybe he was high. Maybe he was just incredibly tired after a long day of work. Or maybe he was just having a hard time deciding what he wanted to buy. But my stomach had this incredibly heavy, sinking feeling by then. It was like my body already knew something was terribly wrong before my brain was willing to admit it. The man was in the store for at least 8 or 9 minutes. Finally, he came up to the counter and placed a bag of chips in front of me. He still did not say a word, so I did not say anything either. I just took the chips, scanned them, and looked down at the register screen. For 1 second, everything felt normal. But then I looked up to tell him the total, and I caught him staring directly into my eyes. He held my gaze for about 2 seconds. That does not sound like a long time, but when you are in a situation like that, 2 seconds feels like an eternity. There was absolutely no expression on his face when he did it. It was completely vacant. Then, without a word, he looked down and handed me the cash. I quickly scanned the money, handed him his change and his bag, and he turned around and walked toward the door. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. I remember thinking to myself that maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe he was just a socially awkward guy. But right as he got to the door and pushed it halfway open, he stopped. And then he turned his head back toward me without fully turning his body around. His chin was slightly lowered, so his eyes had to look up at me. And then he smiled. I still do not know how to explain that smile without sounding dramatic. It looked incredibly forced, wide, and artificial. It looked like he knew exactly how creepy he looked, and he was doing it entirely on purpose. It made every single hair on my body stand up. Then he stepped outside, but instead of walking toward any of the gas pumps or toward a parked car, he began walking around the side of the building. As he did it, he kept his eyes locked on me through the front glass windows. He kept that horrible smile on his face, too. I just stood there frozen, watching him until the angle of the wall cut off my view. I rushed over to the camera monitor and began flipping through the channels to follow his path. I saw him round the corner of the building and head toward the side where the thick woods were, and then he disappeared into the massive blind spot directly behind the building. He did not come back out. I waited 10 seconds, then 20, then a full minute. He never reappeared on any of the other cameras. That was enough for me. I did not care about my boss or getting fired anymore. I locked the front door immediately, even though it was a few minutes before midnight. This next part might sound dramatic, but I texted my family and my friends and told them that there was a creepy guy outside and that I was not joking around anymore. I told them that if I stopped replying to their messages, it meant something bad had probably happened to me because of him. I rushed through the closing procedures as fast as I possibly could. I barely cleaned the counters, and I did not restock anything. I kept checking the cameras over and over again, expecting to see his face pop up in the glass of the front door. But there was nothing. My night finally hit, and I decided I could not stay in that building for another second. I grabbed my keys and my backpack, turned off the main lights, and went to the front door. I unlocked it, stepped outside into the cold air, and immediately locked it behind me. That moment of having to turn my back to the dark parking lot to relock the door was so tense, I felt like my heart was going to burst. Once the key turned, I took off running toward my car, which was parked off to the far side of the building. I got most of the way there, but just as I reached the driver's side door and slowed down for a split second to grab the handle, I heard fast footsteps. It was not the sound of someone running, it was worse somehow. It was the sound of rapid, heavy speed-walking steps, slapping loudly against the pavement in front of the store. I whipped my head around and I saw him. It was that same guy. He had just come around the front corner of the building, and he was moving toward me and my car at an incredibly fast pace. I yanked my car door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. I locked the doors and shoved the key into the ignition, turning it so fast I almost flooded the engine. The second the car started, I threw it into reverse and peeled out of that parking lot, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt. I looked once in my rearview mirror as I sped away, and I saw him standing there, illuminated by the bright headlights of my car, just watching me leave. The entire drive home, I was sending panicked voice texts and regular texts to my friends and family, telling them that I was right, that I knew he was going to come out of nowhere, and that none of this had been a prank. The next day, I texted my boss and told him exactly what had happened. I told him in no uncertain terms that I was never working the overnight shift again. He reviewed the security footage later that afternoon, and his response honestly made me even angrier. He got very defensive and told me that the guy just looked like a regular customer to him. He suggested that maybe I had just gotten spooked because of the weird phone calls, and that I was connecting things that were not actually connected. That pissed me off more than I can explain. I was the one who was there. I was the one who had been receiving those creepy phone calls. I was the one who saw that man disappear around the back of the building. And I was the one who saw him speed walking toward me out of the darkness when I tried to leave. I did not care if the grainy footage did not fully capture how terrifying it felt, because I knew what had happened. I quit the job right after that. I did not even argue with my boss. I just told him that if he thought that was normal, he was welcome to work the closing shift himself. I entered that job with a good attitude, and I left it with one too, because I knew I had saved myself. Even now, many years later, I still believe that the caller on the phone and the guy who came into the store were the exact same person, even if I can never actually prove it. Now, let me tell you about another story that happened to a woman named Cadence. Cadence worked the closing shift at a small dive bar in a quieter, more rural part of her town. The bar was located right off the main highway, but the parking lot also had a back entrance that was easily accessible to the general town. It was not a fancy establishment by any means. It was just a dimly lit, cozy spot where the regulars all knew each other by name, and the old jukebox had been playing the same rotation of classic rock songs for years. Most of the customers were local residents, truckers passing through, and the occasional lost tourist looking for a stiff drink before continuing their journey. Cadence actually liked working there. The routine was highly predictable. The tips were surprisingly decent, and she had learned over the years how to handle the usual bar crowds. She knew how to talk to the chatty customers, how to brush off the flirty ones, how to serve the quiet drinkers, and how to respect the space of the ones who just wanted to be left alone. The weekends at the bar were obviously a lot more hectic and fast-paced, but the thing about working during the week was that Cadence was expected to handle her night shifts completely alone. The owner did not even hire a barback to pop in now and again to help her wash glasses or restock ice. It was easier work and much slower during the weekdays. But Cadence often missed the company of having a coworker around. Because she was alone, she tended to be pretty vigilant during her shifts. The bar attracted a rough crowd sometimes, and she knew that a fight could break out at any moment. That was why she clocked the man immediately when he walked in. It was sometime after 1 o'clock in the morning on a quiet Tuesday when the front door opened. If Cadence had to guess, she would say the man was in his late 40s. But what stood out was how extremely clean-cut and well-groomed he was. He did not have the rugged look you would expect from a guy his age in an area like this. He was wearing a black turtleneck underneath a long, expensive-looking black trench coat. He was definitely well-dressed, but he wore it in a casual way. It is hard to explain, but he had this distinct aura of sophistication about him that made you think of money. Real money, not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet, generational kind. He stood at the entrance for a moment, glancing around the empty bar slowly, before walking swiftly over to the counter and taking a seat. Cadence noticed he had oddly good, rigid posture, but she did not think too much of it at the time. When she walked over to take his order, he glanced at the premium bottles on the shelf behind her and ordered a top-shelf drink without any hesitation. As she was pouring the liquor, the man looked at her with a polite smile and asked if she liked working here. It was a normal enough question for a bartender to receive, so Cadence answered him honestly. She told him that she did, smiled back, and even made a light-hearted joke about the trials of being a bartender. Looking back, she wishes she could say she got a creepy vibe from him right away, but that was not the energy he was giving off at all. He genuinely seemed like a stand-up guy, very polite and charming. He chatted with her for a few minutes, which Cadence did not mind, because the bar was practically empty at that point, and it helped pass the time. But then, the conversation took a slightly strange turn. The man asked her if she had ever thought about doing something bigger with her life. Cadence admitted that it was a somewhat bizarre thing for a stranger to ask, but given the friendly nature of the conversation, she did not find it totally creepy. She just gave him her standard, polite bartender smile and told him that she was happy with where she was for now. The man nodded slowly and took a sip of his drink. He seemed almost disappointed by her answer, though Cadence could not understand why. After a long, quiet pause, he looked at her and asked what time she got off work. That question caught her off guard. She had not picked up on any kind of flirting or romantic interest from him during their conversation, so she felt a sudden wave of disappointment. She realized that this pleasant chat had probably just been another empty, calculated attempt to get her phone number. She smiled politely and gave him a vague, non-committal answer, trying to brush him off in a friendly way without seeming uptight or rude. Before he could press the issue, she busied herself by grabbing a towel and wiping down the opposite end of the counter. The man did not push for more information. He just smiled, as if he already knew exactly what she was thinking. He then drained the rest of his drink, pulled a crisp $100 bill from his pocket, and laid it gently on the bar counter. Without another word, he stood up, turned, and walked out into the cold night. Cadence did not really know what to make of the brief encounter. It seemed like nothing major, but the man's demeanor was just so far off her usual radar that she found herself thinking about him. Either way, she figured she was never going to see him again, so she cleaned his glass and got on with her life. But as it would turn out, she was completely wrong. About a week later, during another quiet weekday shift, the front door opened, and the man walked back in. Only this time, he was not alone. There was a woman walking right beside him. The woman immediately drew Cadence's attention, because she had never seen her in the bar before. She looked like she was in her mid-30s, but she was dressed in a way that did not quite match her age. It was trendy, but off, like someone who was trying just a little bit too hard to blend in with a much younger crowd. Cadence watched them closely as they approached the bar. Everything about the woman's movements seemed highly calculated, from the way she smiled too easily to the way she leaned casually against the bar counter as if they were already close friends. As Cadence walked over and began setting down paper napkins in front of them, the very first thing the woman did was pay her a compliment. She did not say hello, and she did not order a drink. Instead, she put on an overly joyful, beaming smile and said, "You are so pretty." As she said those words, her fingers brushed gently against Cadence's arm, lingering there for just a second longer than normal. Cadence laughed politely and thanked her, but she instantly felt a wave of unease. Something was incredibly off about this woman. The man, on the other hand, did not speak at all. This was also very strange considering how talkative and charming he had been during his first visit. He just sat there quietly, watching, They ordered their drinks, and as Cadence poured them, the woman began peppering her with questions. She asked how long Cadence had been working at the bar, how old she was, and several other personal questions. Cadence answered in short, polite, but guarded sentences. She got the distinct sense that this was not just innocent small talk. The woman was studying her, analyzing her responses. At one point, the woman looked over at the man, and it seemed like they were communicating silently, sharing a look despite not saying a word to each other. The woman then looked back at Cadence, leaned in a bit closer over the counter, and lowered her voice as if she did not want any other patrons in the bar to overhear. She told Cadence that she ran an exclusive, high-end event club. She said she was always on the lookout for young, fun, and attractive people to work private parties. She claimed that Cadence could make a killing doing this, mentioning that she could easily earn $10,000 for just a single weekend of work. Cadence let out a small, forced laugh. She told the woman that it sounded a little bit too good to be true, but the woman insisted it was completely real. She said a bunch of girls just like Cadence worked for them and loved it. The woman's wide, beaming smile never faltered for a single second, and that was what was starting to really creep Cadence out. The woman kept steering the conversation back to the job, circling around the same reassuring words over and over again. She kept saying it was fun, safe, and highly exclusive. And then, very casually, the woman said, "You should step outside with us for just a second. There is someone in the car who can explain how it works much better than I can." At that moment, Cadence's pulse kicked up. She realized this was not a normal job offer. She stopped playing along. She did not even bother pretending like she was not creeped out anymore. She looked the woman dead in the eye, dropping her polite smile, and said, "I am good," in a very firm, serious voice. Just then, a group of loud, laughing customers walked through the front door of the bar. The woman's expression changed in an instant. Her friendly, joyful mask slipped for a split second, revealing a cold, annoyed look. She quickly turned to the man beside her, and without saying another word, the two of them stood up and walked out of the bar. Cadence would be lying if she said she was not deeply unsettled after that night. Two random strangers had essentially just tried to lure her out of her workplace and into a car for God knows what. She immediately told her coworkers and her boss about the incident. They all agreed to keep a close eye out in case those two people ever returned. Her boss assured her that he only lived a 15-minute drive away, and that she could call him at any time if she felt unsafe. He also pointed out that the bar had high-quality security cameras, which were typically enough to deter any bad behavior. There was not much else Cadence could do. After all, the people had not technically done anything illegal. They had just asked some weird questions and made a strange job offer. She tried to push the whole thing out of her mind. But a few nights later, after she had closed up the bar and was preparing to leave, she noticed a car parked directly across the street. The engine was completely off, the headlights were dark, and it was just sitting there in the shadows. She tried to tell herself it was just a random person resting, but the overwhelming feeling of being watched crawled over her skin like static electricity. She kept her head down, clutched her keys tightly between her knuckles, and walked quickly to her vehicle. When she pulled out of the parking lot, she kept a close eye on her mirrors. Sure enough, the dark car pulled out too. It followed her. The driver stayed back just enough to avoid looking obvious, but every single turn Cadence made, the car made too. To test her theory, she took a sudden random turn onto a quiet side street. The car followed. She took another turn. It was still there, trailing her every move. At this point, she was absolutely freaking out internally. She knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was them. She forced herself to stay calm and think logically. Instead of driving toward her home and showing them where she lived, she navigated her way toward the nearest police station. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned completely white. The very second she turned into the bright, camera-heavy parking lot of the police station, the car behind her sped off into the darkness. Nothing happened for a while after that. Cadence started to think that maybe they had finally given up and moved on to someone else. But deep down, she knew it was not over, and she was right. It was a slow, rainy weekday shift, and barely anyone had come into the bar all night. By midnight, Cadence was wiping down the counter, seriously contemplating closing up early and going home, when the heavy front door creaked open. She looked up, and her heart stopped. It was the woman. Cadence kept her cool. She slowly reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and sent a quick, urgent text to her boss under the counter, making sure to be as inconspicuous as possible. When she looked back up, the woman was staring directly at her with that same artificial plastic smile. She walked slowly across the empty floor, took a seat at the bar, and folded her hands neatly on the counter. Cadence was debating whether she should just openly tell the woman to leave when the woman spoke. She said, "Thought I would come check on you." Cadence's stomach started twisting into knots, but she did her best to hide her sheer terror. She looked at the woman and told her that the bar was about to close and that she needed to leave. But the woman made a mock pouty face and pleaded, "Oh, come on, just one old-fashioned before you close up." Cadence thought about refusing her, but then she realized that if she poured the drink, it would stall the woman and keep her in one place long enough for her boss to arrive. So, she turned her back, grabbed a glass, and began preparing the drink, trying her absolute best to keep her hands from shaking. And then she heard it. It was the soft, unmistakable click of the front door shutting. Cadence whipped around instantly. The bar stool was completely empty. The woman was gone. A horrible, heavy pit formed in her stomach. She slowly stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward the glass entrance. She looked out into the dark parking lot, and there it was. A large black van was idling just outside the front door. Without thinking, Cadence rushed forward and locked the deadbolt on the front door as quickly as she could. But then, a loud, violent metal rattling sound erupted from the back of the building. Someone was aggressively shaking the handle of the back exit door, trying to force their way in. Cadence panicked. She knew she did not have time to run. She grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a heavy metal cocktail shaker, and clutched it like a weapon. With her other hand, she dialed 911, but she knew the police station was too far away to get there in time. She thought about making a run for it out the front door, but she was too terrified of the black van waiting there. She stood in the center of the bar, bracing herself for a fight, when she saw bright headlights pull into the parking lot. It was her boss's truck. The violent rattling on the back door suddenly stopped. A second later, the black van pulled out of the parking lot with a loud screech of its tires, disappearing down the highway. When her boss walked in, Cadence threw her arms around him, sobbing as she explained what had just happened. When the police finally arrived, her boss sat down with them and reviewed the security footage from that night. What they saw on the monitors was infinitely worse than anything Cadence had imagined. The cameras showed that just before the woman exited the bar, two tall, masked figures had crept up to the building and crouched down near the front door, waiting in the shadows. Meanwhile, a third masked man had gone to the back of the building and was violently banging on the door with his fists. It became chillingly clear what their plan had been. They were trying to terrify Cadence, using the back door noise to flush her out of the building through the front door, where the two masked men and the black van were waiting to snatch her. It was a perfectly coordinated, horrifying trap. To make matters worse, the license plate number that her boss had managed to write down as the van fled turned out to be completely unregistered. It has been quite a while since that terrifying night, and the police have made absolutely zero progress in identifying the suspects. The only good thing to come out of the whole situation is that Cadence's boss no longer makes her work the closing shifts alone. But despite having company, she still gets incredibly uneasy anytime she is scheduled to work at night. She constantly questions how those people knew she would be alone on those specific nights. It still makes no sense to her, and even now she often lies awake at night, thinking about what would have happened to her if she had given into her fear and run out that front door. Now, let us move on to a third story. This one involves a young man who used to work the night shift at a quiet gas station and convenience store located off a lonely, desolate stretch of a major highway. He stresses the word "used to," because after what happened to him a few months ago, he has vowed never to work a night shift ever again. The station was very small, the kind of place that barely gets any business at all once the sun goes down. Most of his 6-hour shift was spent doing mundane tasks like restocking shelves, wiping down dusty counters, and occasionally ringing up a passing truck driver or a weary traveler. He remembers the night of the incident vividly. It was just past 2:30 in the morning. By that time, even the highway traffic had completely dried up, and he was left with absolutely nothing to do. He sat behind the counter, mindlessly scrolling through social media on his phone just to kill the remaining hours of his shift. At one point, he decided he needed some fresh air to wake himself up. He stepped outside onto the concrete pavement, rubbing his hands together to fight off the biting cold. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath form white clouds that quickly disappeared into the freezing night air. The parking lot was completely empty. There were just the yellow gas pumps, the empty asphalt, the dark highway, and a massive thick stretch of pine trees directly across the road. The bright neon sign of the gas station flickered faintly, making a low buzzing sound. It was incredibly hazy outside, the kind of night where you could literally see the thick moisture hanging in the air. Even with the highway nearby, the silence out there was heavy and suffocating. Right as the employee was about to turn around and walk back inside the warm store, he noticed a sudden movement out of the corner of his eye. He whipped his head around, searching the darkness. That was when he realized there was a person standing directly behind one of the far gas pumps. He was completely frozen. How had he not noticed this person earlier? The figure was wearing a dark red hoodie with the hood pulled up high over his face, and he had both of his hands shoved deep into his front pockets. There was not a single car in the parking lot, which meant this guy had not driven here, and he certainly was not fueling up a vehicle. The strangest part was that he did not seem to be heading toward the convenience store either. He was just standing there in the shadows, half turned toward the building, staring directly at the employee. The employee felt a wave of unease. At first he tried to rationalize it, figuring maybe the guy's car had run out of gas nearby, and he was just waiting for a friend to arrive. But something about the way the man was moving rubbed him completely the wrong way. The hooded figure was slowly shuffling back and forth in a weird, tight circular pattern, never taking his eyes off the store. The employee quickly walked back inside the building. He made sure to keep a close eye on the stranger through the large glass windows, pretending to organize the candy racks while secretly monitoring him. He hoped and prayed that a car would pull up and pick the guy up, or that another customer would arrive to break the tension. But after a few agonizing minutes, the man in the red hoodie started walking toward the front door. He walked slowly at first, but then he suddenly pushed through the glass door, walking inside as if he had made up his mind all at once. He walked straight up to the counter, but instead of asking for something, he just stood there, saying absolutely nothing. He just stared at the employee, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he was sizing him up. Then, in a rushed, stuttering, and almost rehearsed-sounding voice, he muttered that his car had broken down just past the highway entrance. He said he needed a jump start, or maybe just a small can of gas, so he could make it to the next town. The employee was completely shocked by the request, but the problem was, the guy was not even trying to make his story sound believable. The employee could not believe the stranger actually expected him to buy this obvious lie. There was no emotion in the man's face, and his explanation felt completely scripted. Trying to stay professional, the employee offered to call a professional tow truck company to come help him out. No, no, the man said, speaking far too quickly and shaking his head vigorously. He said he did not want a tow truck. He claimed he just needed to borrow a flashlight and maybe get some physical help checking under his hood. At this point, the employee knew something was terribly wrong. The way the man spoke, the nervous way he watched the employee's every reaction, it felt like some sort of test. But then again, people who walk into highway gas stations at 3 in the morning are often a bit strange. The employee started to wonder if the guy actually did need help and was just socially awkward, or perhaps under the influence of something. He asked the man exactly where his car was parked. The man pointed out the window and said it was parked just beyond the highway entrance ramp. The employee was highly skeptical, but then the man pointed at the security camera monitor hanging behind the cash register. I turned to look at the screen, and to my utter surprise, there actually was a car parked out there on the shoulder of the road. For a split second, the employee thought to himself, "Oh crap, maybe this guy really is telling the truth and actually needs my help." But then, a terrifying realization hit him. He had literally just been standing outside in the parking lot, seconds before this man walked in. It was a completely empty, silent night. There was absolutely no way a car had driven up, parked by the highway ramp, and shut its engine off without him hearing it. It was physically impossible. He slowly glanced back at the security monitor, looking closer at the grainy image of the parked vehicle. And that was when he saw it. There was a tiny, subtle movement near the car's back bumper. Someone was crouching down in the dirt, completely hidden in the darkness, just out of view of the highway. A cold wave of pure dread washed over him. He knew that if he walked out of that store to help this man, he was walking straight into an ambush. He forced a casual, friendly smile onto his face and agreed to help the guy. But he told him that he first needed to grab his heavy-duty flashlight and his cell phone from the back office. He turned around slowly, making sure not to show any panic or do anything that might spook the man. But the very second his body was out of the man's direct line of sight, he reached under the counter and slammed his hand onto the emergency panic button. The loud, piercing security alarm went off instantly, its high-pitched screech echoing deafeningly throughout the small store. The employee braced himself, expecting the man in the red hoodie to leap over the counter and attack him. But what the man did instead was even more terrifying. All of his nervous, twitchy energy vanished in an instant. There was no more fake urgency. There was no more shifting nervously from foot to foot. Instead, his entire body relaxed. His posture loosened up, and his hands came slowly out of his pockets. And then he smiled. It was not a panicked smile, and it was not an embarrassed one either. It was a slow, wide, knowing grin. He looked at the employee as if the alarm was highly amusing to him, as if he had all the time in the world. The employee stood there in absolute shock, paralyzed by the sheer creepiness of the man's reaction. In one fluid, athletic motion, the man turned around and bolted out the front door. The employee ran to the camera monitors, watching the screens in horror. He saw the man in the red hoodie sprint across the pavement, but he did not run toward the parked car. Instead, he and the crouched figure from the back bumper both took off sprinting into the pitch-black woods behind the gas station. The parked car just sat there, its engine off and its headlights dark, completely abandoned. By the time the police arrived, the scene was exactly as the employee had described. The stolen car was still parked on the shoulder, but the men had completely vanished. The officers searched the tree line, but there were no clear footprints leading into the thick brush, and no sign of the suspects anywhere. But then, one of the responding officers pointed something out on the car that the employee had not noticed before. The front passenger door of the vehicle was slightly ajar. There had been a third person sitting inside the dark car the entire time, waiting for the signal. The police took the employee's detailed statement and gathered the surveillance footage. A few days later, a detective followed up with him. They had towed the car and run the license plates. It turned out the vehicle had been reported stolen nearly a week earlier, over 100 miles away. No one ever came forward to claim it, and there were no missing persons reports or other crimes linked to the vehicle. It was just a stolen car abandoned in the middle of nowhere by 3 phantom men who disappeared into the dark woods. That happened months ago, and the police still have no leads. The employee quit his job immediately, and he now warns everyone to never work the night shift. Finally, let us look at the 4th story, which took place just a couple of weeks ago at a massive Walmart store. The narrator of this story works the night shift there. She explains that while it is not the worst job in the world, after a while, it really starts to feel like you are just floating through time. The nights all blend together into one continuous loop of the same shelves, the same routine, and the same dull, depressing hum of the bright overhead fluorescent lights. She is constantly hoping that a better job opportunity will come along soon. She is typically assigned to stock and organize the electronics section. She actually prefers this area because it is much quieter and more isolated than the rest of the store. People do not exactly come rushing into Walmart at 2 o'clock in the morning to buy phone chargers, headphones, or Bluetooth speakers. Most of the nighttime customers are either night owls killing time, or truck drivers grabbing last-minute supplies before hitting the highway again. Because the section was so empty, she noticed the man almost immediately. At first, she did not think much of it. He just looked like another random customer wandering the aisles, perhaps waiting for a family member to finish shopping in another part of the store. But after a few minutes had passed, she realized that he was not actually shopping. In fact, He was not even pretending to look at the merchandise. He just kept appearing. Every single time she glanced up from the boxes she was unpacking, he was standing nearby. He was always hovering in the next aisle over, or standing a little too still by the clearance rack. He was not looking at the products on display. He was just standing there, completely still, watching her. She tried to tell herself that she was just being paranoid and overthinking the situation. Walmart is a massive store, and maybe the guy was just taking his time. But there was something about the way he moved that set off a deep, primal alarm in her gut. He always stayed just close enough for her to notice his presence, but he never actually picked up an item or approached her. It was highly unsettling. It was almost like he wanted her to know that he was watching her, which made absolutely no sense to do. She waited for him to just get it over with, assuming he was just a creepy guy trying to build up the courage to ask for her phone number. But he never did. She decided she was going to radio her manager to report the suspicious behavior. But when she reached for her walkie-talkie and tried to turn it on, she realized the batteries were completely dead. It was not working at all. She stood there, debating whether she should walk away from her section to go find a manager in person. But before she could make a decision, she felt a sudden firm hand wrap around her arm. She nearly jumped out of her skin in terror, but before she could scream or react, a woman's voice rang out. The voice was incredibly loud, friendly, and overly familiar. The woman exclaimed, "There you are," and immediately went into a loud, energetic spiel about how she had been looking all over the store for her. The employee turned around, completely thrown off and confused. She found herself staring at a woman she had never seen before in her entire life. The woman was smiling warmly, her grip on the employee's arm firm and tight, acting as if they were two old high school friends reuniting after years apart. But before the employee could say a word to correct her, the woman leaned in very close. Her friendly expression vanished, and her voice dropped to a low, urgent whisper. She said, "That guy over there has been recording you on his phone. Follow me right now." The employee's stomach dropped. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back over her shoulder. Sure enough, the man in the electronics aisle was still there. Only now, he was no longer pretending to browse. He was standing in the center of the aisle, staring directly at her with a cold, intense glare. A wave of icy fear washed over the employee. She did not question the woman's story. She let the woman pull her away, clutching onto her arm. She felt a massive wave of gratitude, believing that this brave customer had noticed her being stalked and had put herself in an uncomfortable situation just to save her from a predator. As they walked quickly down the main aisle, the woman kept up her loud, friendly act, rambling on about a fictional trip they had taken and sharing fake inside jokes. The employee barely processed a single word she was saying. Her mind was entirely focused on the creepy man. Had he really been recording her? It was deeply violating. She wanted to look back to see if he was following them, but she could not muster up the courage to turn her head. The woman steered her through the massive store, moving at a very fast pace. The employee was so panicked that she barely noticed where they were going. She was just glad that the distance between her and the stalker was growing. She kept waiting for the woman to drop the act now that they were farther away, but the woman just kept pulling her forward. After a while, it started to feel a bit uncomfortable. The employee glanced back over her shoulder. To her immense relief, the creepy man was nowhere to be seen. He had not followed them. The employee slowed her pace and told the woman that they were safe now, and that they should head toward the front of the store to find a manager and call security. But the woman did not slow down. Instead, she squeezed the employee's arm even tighter, her nails digging into her skin. She whispered urgently, "No, we can't stop. He is still lurking around here somewhere. We have to keep moving." The employee started to feel a different kind of dread. She thought to herself, so what if he is still in the store? Walmart is full of other employees and overnight stockers. What could he possibly do to her if she was standing next to her coworkers? The initial terror of being stalked was starting to fade, replaced by a strange, uneasy feeling about the woman who was holding her. She looked around, trying to figure out where they were. Her heart sank. They had moved completely past the main registers, past the self-checkout lanes, and far away from the bright aisles that saw the most employee foot traffic. They were entering the warehouse and shipping section of the store. It It was incredibly dark, quiet, and completely devoid of people. And just ahead of them was the heavy metal side exit door. This was the door that did not have any security cameras, the one that employees only used for loading heavy shipments onto trucks. At that exact moment, a terrifying realization dawned on her. This woman was not trying to save her. She was leading her straight to an isolated, unmonitored exit. She did not hesitate. The employee opened her mouth and let out a blood-curdling scream for help. At the same time, she yanked her arm back with all of her physical strength, trying to break the woman's grip. The sudden, violent movement caught the woman off guard, and her fingers slipped. The employee broke free. She did not waste a single second. She turned around and sprinted as fast as her legs could carry her back toward the bright lights of the sales floor. As she ran, she heard the woman scream out behind her in a furious, angry voice. The woman yelled for her to come back, and then she yelled the employee's actual name. The employee had never introduced herself. She was not wearing her name tag that night because she had forgotten it in her locker. She kept running, her heart pounding in her chest, until she finally ran into one of her male coworkers who was rushing toward her, having heard her screams. She frantically told him to call security immediately. He did, and the store was put on high alert. But by the time the security guards searched the area, both the man and the woman were completely gone. Later that night, the security team reviewed the surveillance footage from the entire evening. What they saw on the screens made the employees' blood run cold. The footage showed that the man and the woman had walked into the Walmart together, side by side. They had been working as a team the entire time. The man's job was to stalk the employee, acting as the creepy threat to terrify her. The woman's job was to play the role of the helpful, heroic savior, gaining the employee's trust, so she would willingly follow her right out of the building, and into whatever vehicle was waiting for them outside the side exit. It was a highly sophisticated, chillingly calculated kidnapping plot. The security cameras had captured a crystal clear image of the man's face, but the woman had been careful, always keeping her head turned away from the lenses. The police were called, and they officially launched an investigation into the failed abduction attempt. The employee is still waiting for updates, hoping they will identify the man from the footage. But what terrifies her the most, what keeps her awake at night, shaking with fear, is how that strange woman knew her name. They had not chosen her at random. She had been a specific, pre-selected target. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When most of us think about schools, we picture crowded hallways, loud teenagers, and the constant hum of daytime activity. We see teachers writing on whiteboards, friends talking by their lockers, and coaches shouting instructions on the gym floor. It is a place of learning and energy. But there is a completely different version of these buildings that very few people ever get to see. It is the school that exists after 10 o'clock at night. When the last teacher turns off their desk lamp, locks their classroom door, and drives home, a heavy silence settles over the empty corridors. For the night custodians, this is when their workday actually begins. It is a lonely and often unsettling job. You walk down corridors that are usually filled with the loud chatter of hundreds of young students. But now, the only thing you can hear is the hum of your own thoughts. You are completely alone in a massive structure that was built to hold thousands of people. Every single step you take echoes down the hallways. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a threat. Most night custodians will tell you that you eventually get used to the quiet. You learn to tune out the strange noises and focus on your work. But sometimes the noises are not just the building settling. Sometimes something is down there with you. Our first story begins with a man who worked as an overnight custodian at an old middle school. He spent almost 5 years working the late shift. His schedule was always the same. He would arrive at the school, clock in around 10 o'clock at night, and work until just before the sun came up. In the beginning, he actually enjoyed the work. He was a quiet guy who liked to be left alone, and this job was perfect for that. He did not have to deal with noisy kids running through the hallways. He could just put his headphones in, push his cleaning cart, and do his job in peace. But as the months turned into years, he started to notice how different the school felt at night compared to during the day. It wasn't just quiet, it felt dead. The building itself was quite old, having been built back in the 1950s. The walls would groan, the heating pipes would knock, and the roof would creak whenever the wind blew outside. When you are the only person in a 3-story building, your brain starts to play tricks on you. A locker door upstairs would suddenly pop open with a loud click, or a draft would blow a piece of paper across the floor. For the most part, he learned to ignore these little things. But there was one specific area of the school that he could never get used to, and that was the basement. The basement of this middle school was not a nice finished area. Because the school was built in the 1950s, the basement was basically a massive concrete maze that ran under about half of the entire campus. It was dark, damp, and smelled constantly of wet cement and old, musty paper. The ceilings were low, with thick rusted pipes and tangled black wires hanging down just above your head. The basement was divided into several different storage rooms. Some of these rooms were filled with towering piles of wooden desks. Others were packed with heavy cardboard boxes containing outdated textbooks that had not been opened in 30 years. The lighting down there was terrible. The old fluorescent bulbs would buzz loudly and flicker constantly, and half of them did not even work at all. If you had to go down there, you always had to bring a powerful flashlight. On his very first week on the job, one of the older custodians had pulled him aside. The older man had a serious look on his face when he told him to avoid the basement unless it was absolutely necessary. He joked that the basement was haunted, but our custodian noticed that the older man never laughed with his eyes. He realized that the veterans on the staff genuinely avoided that basement. Even just walking past the heavy wooden door that led downstairs gave our custodian a cold, uneasy feeling, so he avoided it whenever possible. For the first 2 years of his employment, he managed to keep that promise. But one night, his luck finally ran out. He was looking at the daily task list his supervisor had taped to his cart. At the bottom of the list was a note. It instructed him to go down to the basement and bring up several stacks of metal folding chairs for an event the following morning. As soon as he read the note, his stomach dropped. He stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time, holding the heavy brass handle of the door, debating if he could ask his supervisor if it could wait until morning. But he did not want to look lazy. So he grabbed his flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped onto the concrete stairs. The door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the warm light from the main hallway. The stairwell echoed with every step he took, like his boots were way too loud. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he reached out and flipped the main light switch. A few of the fluorescent lights down the long hallway buzzed to life, leaving most of the hallway in darkness. The smell of wet cement was overwhelming. He turned on his flashlight and started walking. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The first room was full of old desks, piled all the way to the ceiling. The second door was half rusted, and it squealed like nails on a chalkboard when he pulled it open. Inside, the room smelled of dust and wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall in uneven piles. He bent down and started pulling them out, trying to carry as many as he could at once, so he would not have to make so many trips. He had just picked up 4 when he froze. From somewhere out in the hallway, he heard a soft dragging sound, like someone was slowly sliding their shoe across the concrete floor. He held his breath, still bent over with the chairs in his arms. Listening as hard as he could, the sound stopped. He slowly stood up and peeked his head out into the hallway, shining the flashlight both ways. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. His heart was thumping in his ears. He stood there for what felt like forever, before finally telling himself it was probably just the pipes, or maybe he had shifted a chair without realizing it. He carried the first load out into the hallway and toward the stairs. As he walked, he suddenly felt a cold draft against his face. It was so out of place that it made him stop mid-step. The basement was always warm and stale with no windows. This felt like standing next to an open freezer. He shined his light up and down the hallway, but nothing looked different. He shook it off, set the chairs at the bottom of the stairs, and went back for more. When he walked into the storage room again, something felt off. The stack of chairs looked different, like they had shifted while he was gone. He frowned at them, trying to remember exactly how they had been leaning. He finally told himself he was just being paranoid, and picked up another load. This time, as he turned to leave, he heard it again, a thump followed by a scraping sound. It came from farther down the basement hallway. His flashlight beam shook in his hand as he aimed it that way. About 20 feet down, one of the classroom doors that should have been closed tight was cracked open. His stomach dropped. He knew he had not touched that door. The school was locked up every night, and no one was supposed to be there except him. He stood frozen in the doorway of the storage room, staring at that cracked door. Every part of him screamed to drop the chairs and run upstairs, but he just stood there. He told himself that maybe the door had come loose, or maybe when he opened another door, the air pressure had shifted. He clung to those excuses like a lifeline. He carried the chairs quickly to the stairwell, then came back with his flashlight in one hand, empty-handed this time. The cracked door was still there, open just enough for someone to peek out. His throat went dry. He crept toward it slowly, each step echoing. When he was close, he called out, "Hello, anyone down here?" His voice cracked and it sounded small in the big empty basement. No answer. He swallowed hard, then pushed the door open fast with his free hand and shined the flashlight inside. The room was completely and utterly empty, just shells of dusty science equipment, boxes stacked high, cobwebs in the corners. He stepped inside for a second, heart racing, listening for any sound. That is when he heard it again, a dragging shuffle, but this time it was behind him in the hallway. He spun around and pointed the flashlight with the beam cutting down the corridor. Nothing, just shadows and concrete, but he felt it. That heavy pressure you get when you know you are being watched. His skin prickled all over. He did not care about the chairs anymore. He backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed down the hallway, and made his way toward the stairwell. When he got to the stairs, he grabbed the chairs he had left and carried them up 2 steps at a time. He did not stop until he was back in the main hallway upstairs, gasping for breath. He leaned against the wall, sweating even though the school was cold. He told himself he was imagining things. Maybe it had been rats or water pipes, but he could not explain the cracked door. He locked the stairwell door behind me, even though he was not supposed to, and he did not go back down for the rest of the night. A week later, he was mopping the hallway right above the basement stairs when he heard it again. 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like someone hitting the wall with their fist. The mop slipped out of his hand, water dripping onto the tiles. He froze and listened. Then he heard the basement door rattle like someone had shoved it from the other side. His blood went cold. He did not open it. He stood there gripping the mop handle until the sound stopped. After that, he refused to go down into the basement alone. If anything needed to come up, he would wait until another custodian was there. He never told the others what he heard, because he knew they would either laugh or tell me it was the so-called ghost. But he knows what he felt, and he knows what he heard. To this day, when he thinks about those slow dragging footsteps behind me, he feels sick to his stomach. It is a memory that has stayed with him for years, and it is the main reason why he eventually decided to leave that school district altogether. Our second story takes us to a high school, where a custodian worked for 3 years. He was the newest guy on the team, so most of the time he got stuck with the overnight shifts. The building was huge, with 4 floors and 2 gymnasiums, and at night when it was empty, it felt like a giant maze. The rule was to go floor by floor, room by room, turning off lights, emptying trash, and locking doors. It usually took the whole night to cover everything, and if you tried to rush, you would miss something. One Friday night, he was working alone because one of the other custodians had called out sick. Normally, they worked in pairs, so he was not used to being the only one on duty. At first, the shift was normal. He started on the first floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the hallways. The lights in some of the old corridors flickered, which made the shadows jump around, but he told himself it was just the building settling. Around midnight, he made his way up to the 3rd floor. That floor always gave him a bad feeling because it was quieter than the others. It had a lot of older classrooms that were not used anymore. Some permanently locked, and others were just storage rooms filled with dusty books, broken furniture, and old lab equipment. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the lockers. The metallic click of the doors and the echo of his boots against the tiles made him jump a few times. He kept reminding himself it was normal. He was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when he noticed a door about 20 feet away was open. That struck him immediately, because he had already checked all the rooms earlier in the evening, and every door had been locked. His first instinct was to walk past it quickly and ignore it. But something made him stop. He set his mop against the wall and walked over slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window. He pushed it open slowly, shining his flashlight inside. The room looked empty. The desks were stacked along the walls, and boxes were in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then he noticed that one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was tilted, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor, like it had been dragged across the tiles. His stomach sank. He knew he had closed that door earlier, and he knew he had not moved that box. He told himself it was probably nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him because he was tired. He pulled the door closed and went back to mopping, but his mind kept wandering to that room. He kept thinking he should check the windows. Maybe a student had snuck in somehow, but all the windows were locked from the inside. He tried to shake the feeling of being watched and focused on the cleaning. After finishing that hallway, he went down to the stairwell to head to the second floor. As he walked past that same classroom again, his heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he had shut it before. He slowly stepped closer. He peeked inside and the room looked normal, except the box was now moved to the center of the floor. His pulse was racing. He whispered, "Hello, who is in here?" His voice sounded tiny in the emptiness of the building. He waited, but there was silence. And then from the back of the room he heard slow, deep breathing. Not a gust of wind or a pipe. It was someone trying to be quiet, but making sure he could hear it. He tried to convince himself it was a student hiding, playing a prank. But how would they have gotten in? He was the only one who was supposed to be there, and all the doors were locked. He slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. His heart was hammering and sweat ran down his back. He stayed pressed against the stairwell door, listening. He debated calling his supervisor, even though he hated bothering him in the middle of the night. Finally, he did. When his supervisor picked up, our custodian told him what was happening, trying to keep his voice steady. The supervisor said he would be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. He stayed as far away from that room as possible, peeking over his shoulder every few seconds. Finally, his supervisor arrived. They went back up together. The supervisor had a big flashlight and walked straight into the classroom. The box was still in the middle of the floor. They checked everywhere. The closets, under the tables, behind the desks, there was nothing. He suggested the custodian was just tired or imagining things. The custodian did not argue, but he knew what he had heard. That slow, heavy breathing. He tried to finish the rest of his shift with his supervisor there, but he kept glazing at that classroom. The hallway felt colder and more oppressive than ever. Even sweeping and mopping did not distract him. Weeks later, when he worked with another custodian, he was told that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that classroom overnight. They had snuck in to play a prank, but it scared the staff so much that they never used that room again. It made sense, but it did not explain the breathing he heard that night. There was no one else in the school. He finished the shift and left, but every time he thought about it, his stomach twisted. He started taking extra precautions, ensuring all doors were locked, and eventually he transferred out of the school. Our third story comes from a night custodian who worked at an old high school for 2 years. The worst part of the job was always the auditorium. It was massive with 3 levels of seating, a big stage, and long, heavy curtains that hung from the ceiling. During the day, it looked normal. But at night, when the building was empty, it felt like stepping into a completely different place. Even with the lights on, there were shadows in every corner that seemed darker than they should be. Sound carried strangely in there. If you dropped a broom, the echo would stretch and bounce, making it hard to tell exactly where the sound came from. Most nights, he saved the auditorium for last because he hated going in there. There was just something about it that always made his skin crawl. Near the end of winter one year, he had to clean it earlier than usual because there was going to be a play the next morning. He arrived around midnight, dragging his cart behind him. The side door creaked loudly as he opened it, and when it slammed shut behind him, the echo traveled across the empty room. He started by sweeping the aisles between the seats. The chairs were old metal, folding seats bolted to the floor in some rows, and in other rows they were loose. As he pushed the broom, he listened to the scraping sound echo off the walls and ceiling. After a few minutes, he thought he heard something else. It was faint at first, like a soft rustling from the stage. He froze, thinking maybe a prop had fallen over. But when he looked, the stage was empty. He shook his head and told himself it was nothing. He continued sweeping. A few minutes later, he heard it again. This time it was more distinct, the sound of slow footsteps across the stage. He stopped sweeping and looked toward the stage. He could see the stacked props in the corners. Nothing moved, but the sound was real. His breathing became shallow. He slowly climbed the steps onto the stage, shining the flashlight behind the curtains. There were ropes, pulleys, old chairs, and painted scenery stacked against the walls. Everything was covered in dust, and the beam of his light made it dance like it was moving. He could not shake the feeling that someone or something was nearby. He backed off the stage, telling himself it was just the building settling, maybe a mouse in the rafters, but the feeling did not go away. He continued sweeping down the aisles, trying to finish as fast as possible. His mind kept going back to the stage. The sound of those slow footsteps repeated in his head, even though he could not hear them anymore. He finished sweeping the lower level and started mopping. As he pushed the mop through the rows, he thought he saw a shadow move across the second tier of seats. He moved his flashlight toward the seats, but nothing was there. The whispering came again, much clearer this time. It sounded exactly like someone speaking his name almost directly behind him. He spun around so fast that the flashlight slipped in his hands. The stage was completely empty. Nothing. The props were still stacked in the same place, and the curtains did not move, but he knew he had not imagined the voice. He backed away slowly with his heart racing, and he moved toward the side door. He stopped at the edge of the stage and listened. He could hear soft footsteps on the upper levels moving slowly across the balcony. He told himself it was impossible. The auditorium was locked. No one else should have been there. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting as if someone were pacing and watching him. He finally ran to the door, grabbed the handle, and pulled it open. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and he felt relief, but he could still hear the faint echo of footsteps above, fading away slowly. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely lock the heavy door behind him. He leaned against the cold metal, catching his breath and feeling the sweat running down his forehead. He did not go back inside that night. Weeks later, he learned that years ago, a drama teacher had died suddenly in that auditorium during a rehearsal. He had a sudden heart attack right on stage in front of his students. People said sometimes you could still hear him walking the stage at night, or hear whispers in the seats. He tried to convince himself it was just a story, but he knew what he felt. He quit that job not long after, and he never looked back. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. 10 years ago, my friends and I were typical 13-year-olds living on the same block. Back then, there were far fewer houses and much more dense woods. I had 3 close friends, Mark, James, and Matt. On one Saturday night, we decided to go out for some classic ding-dong ditching. Mark or James would run up to the houses and ring the doorbells, while Matt and I would find hiding spots. We hit about 5 or 6 houses. The reactions were pretty standard. Homeowners would step onto the porch, yell, and slam the door. For a couple of houses, we went back and rang the bell again just for a bigger reaction. One man was so angry, he yelled that he was calling the police. The second his front door shut, we all panicked. We bolted down the street and headed over to the next block. And so, we ended up on the next block. This part of the neighborhood was much less developed, with patches of woods surrounding some of the properties. The first house we approached was across from a thick patch of woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. The house was rundown with tall grass, a ratty old car covered in a dusty tarp, and a neglected look. Mark volunteered to go up and ring the bell. He walked across the street and pushed the button. But he barely had time to make it across the street before the front door swung wide open. It was another man who answered. This guy was absolutely massive, about 6 feet tall and stocky. Unlike the others, he was furious immediately. He walked all the way out into his front yard, checking behind his bushes and yelling threats. We were hiding in the woods, laughing silently. Eventually, the man went back inside and slammed his door, but Mark was feeling bold. He waited a few minutes, checked the windows, and then ran back up the steps to ring the bell for a second time. Mark knew he did not have much time, so he ran around to the side of the house, out of sight. The front door opened much quicker this time, and the man came out holding a rifle. We looked at each other in the dark woods and whispered, "Oh shit." The man marched down the steps. He checked behind his car, looked behind a couple of trees, and then stood in the center of his lawn, completely still. He slowly turned his head, scanning the area, and his eyes stopped on us. Matt, James, and I froze, ducking as low as we could. After about 10 seconds of staring in our direction, the man finally went back inside, but then we saw him appear at his front window, standing like a statue, staring directly at us. But then the silence was broken. We heard Mark's voice screaming at the top of his lungs, "Run!" We did not understand what was happening until we heard the heavy rustling of leaves and branches coming from right behind us. We turned our heads, and our hearts stopped. It was the massive man. He had sneaked out his back door, circled around into the woods, and was now running up from behind us with his rifle raised and pointed directly at us. We scrambled to our feet, running like prey from a predator. We bolted out of the woods toward Mark, who was waiting for us across the street. We ran for several blocks until we were absolutely sure we had lost him. Mark later explained that he saw the man sneak into the woods to ambush us. We were so terrified that we never reported him to the police. Luckily, that house was many blocks away, so we never had to go near it again. But it was a harsh lesson in how quickly a childish prank can turn deadly. Fast forward to my college years, when I ended up living in a house that I can only describe as a living hell. At the time, I was a university student, and my parents were paying the rent for a small house for me to live in. I know that sounds spoiled, and I was incredibly grateful. The house itself was modest, nothing fancy. And for the first few days, I was absolutely thrilled. It felt like the ultimate freedom. But that feeling did not last long, because things quickly started to get very strange. It all began on a gray, rainy Saturday afternoon. While watching television in the living room, I suddenly heard a distinct scraping sound coming from the hardwood floor. I sat up and looked around, thinking that maybe a wild animal had somehow gotten inside the house, but the room was completely empty. I tried to shake it off, sat back down, and resumed watching. Later that night, around midnight, I perked up when I thought I heard a strange noise from the kitchen. I grabbed a throw pillow as some sort of weapon and cautiously walked over. There, in the middle of the dark kitchen floor, was a box of Cheerios. The box was completely tipped over, and hundreds of tiny cereal pieces were spilled out across the floor. As I was sweeping them up, I heard a very distinct creak, like the sound weak areas of a wooden floor make when someone steps on them. The sound came from right by the kitchen table. I quickly looked up, but there was absolutely nobody. I finished cleaning up and went back to watching TV, eventually drifting off into an hour-long nap on the couch. The next day was normal, but on the next rainy day, the strange occurrences started up again. I woke up in my bed feeling sicker than I had ever felt in my life. It felt as though I had been out drinking heavy alcohol all night. Even though I had not touched a drop, I was incredibly nauseous, weak, and dizzy. Because of how awful I felt, I stayed in bed all day with a garbage pail right next to my bed in case I needed to throw up. At around midday, I suddenly heard a very distinct sound coming from directly above me in the attic. The attic door was in my bedroom ceiling. It was not just a single thud, it was 3 or 4 heavy footsteps. Despite the fact that every time I moved, I wanted to puke, I managed to force myself out of bed. I pulled the string to the attic door down, grabbed an old metal baseball bat, and climbed the steps. I pulled the light switch cord to illuminate the space, but there were only some old boxes. I climbed back down quickly because the cramped attic made me incredibly uneasy, but the noises did not stop. That night I woke up to a sound that I initially mistook for thunder. I was still feeling incredibly sick. Then the familiar, heavy thud echoed from up in the attic, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I pulled the string to the attic door down once again, grabbed my baseball bat, and climbed the steps into the darkness. To build up my own courage, I yelled out demanding to know who was up there. But before I could reach for the light cord, the silence of the pitch-black attic was broken by a child giggling right in front of me. I was out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. We packed everything up the next day and I moved back home. I know it was really paranormal. Several years ago, when I was 20, I took a job working as a housemaid for an elderly woman named Mel. She lived in a massive, ancient house on a secluded property. The land was about 2 acres, surrounded by thick woods in 3 directions, with a road on the other. If the property had been taken care of, it could have been beautiful, but instead, it was overgrown, neglected, and eerie. The house itself was extremely old, constructed of dark wood, and the interior was perpetually dim. For some reason, she insisted on keeping the blinds tightly shut. Whenever I opened them during the day to let sunlight in, she would close them again. To make things even creepier, she preferred to light several of the rooms using only candles, which made the inside of the house feel prehistoric. And of course, the floors creaked loudly with every single step. Mel was around 70 years old. Most of the work she had me do consisted of physical tasks she could no longer manage, like sweeping, dusting, washing dishes, doing laundry, and sorting mail. One weekend, Mel asked me to sleep there for a night or two to help. The house had 4 bedrooms, yet she lived alone, so it was not an issue. I arrived on Friday, speaking few words to her. I dropped my backpack in my assigned bedroom. As I turned, I saw Mel standing in the doorway. She had a creepy way about her, and this was no exception. She did not say hello or ask how my drive was. Instead, she coldly instructed me to clean the guest bedroom immediately, and then ordered me to straighten up the rest of the house. Once she gave her orders, she turned and walked slowly upstairs to her own bedroom. I did not see her again for the rest of the afternoon, but as I worked downstairs, the silence of the house made every noise she made upstairs sound extremely loud. I could hear her heavy, slow footsteps pacing back and forth across her bedroom ceiling. It sounded like she was walking in circles, from one end of her room to the other, over and over again. It was incredibly strange, especially since there were no televisions, radios, or books in the house. I had no idea what she could possibly be doing up there for hours on end in the dark, but the weirdest part of the house was the basement. From the very beginning, Mel made it absolutely clear that the basement was completely off limits. She warned me in a very serious tone that I was never, under any circumstances, to go down there. Nighttime finally arrived, and because I was exhausted, and there was absolutely nothing else to do, I decided to just go to bed early. This was back before everyone had smartphones, so I did not have any screen to look at to pass the time. I did not even know the exact hour, but I guessed it was probably around 9 or 10 o'clock. For the first few hours, the entire house was completely silent, except for the occasional creaking of the old wood settling in the wind. However, I found it almost impossible to actually fall asleep because the mattress was incredibly stiff, lumpy, and uncomfortable. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, staring up at the dark ceiling, feeling incredibly uneasy. It felt like hours had passed when I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floors. It sounded like Mel was passing my room really slowly. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but then she stopped outside my door this time. I sat up and listened. I could hear the creaking from behind the door of Mel standing there, and it was starting to creep me out. She finally walked away. I heard her go down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and close from downstairs. I had a feeling it was the basement door. A long time passed before I heard the basement door open and close again, and then heavy, slow footsteps coming up the creaky stairs. The footsteps once again came to my door, then stopped. I sat up once again to listen, and I could hear creaks of pressure on the floor outside the door, and then I heard the doorknob start to turn. I laid back down and pulled the sheets over me and pretended to be asleep. I heard Mel take a few steps into the room, pause, and then leave. She went back to her room and shut the door. I was a bit disturbed. I waited in the dark for about half an hour, making sure her door stayed closed, before deciding I absolutely had to see what was in that basement. My curiosity had completely taken over. I slowly got out of the rickety bed, tiptoed to my bedroom door, and then tiptoed down the stairs the best I could, trying to avoid the loudest creaks in the wood. I reached the bottom of the stairs, opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the light switch, and crept down the steps into the cool, musty air. I made it to the very bottom step, and immediately had to force myself to hold in a loud scream. There were two old wooden chairs sitting dead center in the middle of the concrete floor, and in those chairs were two of what I could only describe as decaying human corpses. They had synthetic wigs placed on their heads. The horrific sight of a bug crawling out of the eye socket of one of them made me want to throw up right there. I brought myself to walk deeper into the basement, closer to the corpses. I had to make sure they were real. Both of the corpses had men's wigs on them. The bigger of the two also had a beret on. I don't know much about corpses or their rate of decaying, but I'd say these corpses were both almost a year old. I felt like my heart stopped momentarily when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs on the first floor. I couldn't make it to the light switch. I had no time. I hid behind one of the couches in the basement as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down one creaky stair at a time. I had my hands covering my mouth as I heard Mel reach the last stair. I heard her whisper my name. For half a second, I looked around the couch and saw Mel halfway across the basement already, with a big kitchen knife in her hand. I knew she would be too slow to catch me, so I ran for it to the stairs. She screamed my name and followed as fast as she could. When I made it to the first floor of the house, I ran upstairs to the bedroom I was sleeping in to grab my backpack. By the time I ran back downstairs, Mel was at the top basement step. I ran out the front door and to my car. I turned the key, caught my breath, looked back toward the front door of the big old house, and saw Mel standing there in the porch light holding the knife. I drove off the property and down the dark road, making it back to the safety of my home within 10 minutes. Fortunately, since I had only worked for her for a couple of weeks, I had never given Mel any of my personal information, such as my home address or my phone number, so she was never able to contact me again. If I had to guess, I would say one of those corpses belonged to her dead husband that she had mentioned twice to me during my time working there. As for the other smaller corpse, I have absolutely no idea, and I am not sure I want to know. It was a deeply disturbing scene to witness, and it became clear that something was incredibly wrong with that woman, leaving me with questions that will haunt me forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine living completely by yourself in a small rental house on the edge of town. It was a simple, one-story place located at the end of a quiet, dead-end road. On this entire street, there were only 5 houses, and because of this, night times were incredibly quiet. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so my daily routine was pretty repetitive. I rarely left the house unless I absolutely had to grab groceries or run a quick errand. Visitors were a rare sight for me. My friends always knew to text me before they decided to drop by, so I never really expected anyone to just show up. That is why the first knock on my door stood out so much. It was about 8:45 on a Thursday night. I was sitting comfortably in my living room watching some television when suddenly I heard 4 very firm, deliberate knocks on my front door. I paused for a second, muted the television, and waited. At first, I thought maybe I had just imagined the sound, but then 2 more sharp knocks followed. I stood up and walked slowly toward the front door. Right in the center of the door, there was a small peephole. I stepped up to it and looked through. On my front porch stood a man holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was wearing a dark jacket and a simple baseball cap. To be honest, he looked completely normal, maybe in his mid-30s. I opened the door, but kept the security chain firmly attached. The moment the door opened slightly, the man immediately spoke up. He told me he had a delivery that required a signature. He then looked down at a small handheld electronic device and read a name out loud. The problem was, it was not my name at all. It was not even close. I looked at him and said that he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then back at his device, and then directly at me. He read the address out loud, and this time, it was my exact address, word for word. I shook my head and told him that absolutely nobody by that name lived at this address. The man just stood there and stared at me for a second or two longer than was necessary. It felt incredibly awkward. Finally, he said that he must have been given the wrong information, and that he would take the package back to his truck. I watched through the window as he walked back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van or some kind of car parked nearby, but there was absolutely nothing. He just walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the road. I could not see where he went after that. I shut the door, locked it, and went back inside. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a delivery driver working for a small company, or maybe a contractor using their own unmarked vehicle. It seemed like a logical explanation, so I tried to let it go. But the very next night, at almost the exact same time, around 8:45, the knocks came again. This time, there were 3 of them. I felt a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not open the door this time. Instead, I went straight to the peephole to see who was outside. It was the exact same man, wearing the same dark jacket, and holding the exact same cardboard box. I refused to open the door. I just spoke loudly through the wood, telling him that he had already come by the night before, and that nobody by that name lived here. There was a long, heavy silence. Then the man spoke up, saying that he really just needed a signature, and that his system showed the package absolutely had to be delivered tonight. I told him firmly that I was not going to sign for a package meant for someone I did not know. Another long pause followed. Then, he simply said okay, and took a step back from the door. I kept my eye pressed against the peephole. Instead of turning around and walking away immediately, he just stood at the edge of my porch, looking around. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the dark side of the house, and then looked right back at the front door. After about 15 seconds of this, he finally walked down the driveway. Once again, there was no vehicle anywhere in sight. That was the moment when everything started to feel deeply wrong. On the 3rd night, there were no knocks. I actually felt an immense wave of relief wash over me. I thought that maybe he had finally figured out his mistake and moved on. I even made a little joke to myself about how bizarre it would have been if he actually showed up for a 3rd time. But on the 4th night, that relief completely vanished. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Suddenly, I heard 4 knocks, but the problem was they did not come from the front door. They came from the side of the house, right against my dining room window. I froze, holding a wet plate in my hands. I slowly walked into the dining room and stared at the window, but I could not see anyone through the glass. Then, almost instantly, 4 more heavy knocks echoed from the front door. My heart began to pound. I hurried over to the peephole and looked through. It was him again, but this time something was different. He was not holding a box anymore. His hands were completely empty. I stayed absolutely silent, hoping he would think nobody was home. He knocked again, harder this time. Then he stepped back and stared directly at the peephole, almost as if he knew I was standing right there looking at him. I quickly backed away from the door, making sure not to make a single sound or cause any movement that might show through the lens. After about 30 seconds, he finally turned around and walked away. I waited for 5 full minutes, letting the silence stretch out, before I dared to check the windows. I walked through the house with all the lights turned off, carefully parting the blinds just a fraction of an inch to look outside. And that was when I saw him. He was standing directly across the street, right near the tree line. He was completely motionless, just standing there in the dark, facing my house. After about a minute of watching him, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the woods. I went around the entire house and relocked every single window and door, even though I knew they were already locked. The very next day, I decided I had enough. I called the local police non-emergency line and explained the entire situation to the officer on duty. The officer listened carefully and told me that this sounded like a classic case of someone trying to verify occupancy. He explained that burglars will often knock on doors to see if anyone answers before they attempt to break in later on. He advised me to install some security cameras if I could, and told me to call 911 immediately if the man returned. That night, I decided to play it safe. I left all the front lights of the house completely off and stayed in my bedroom at the back. Right on cue, around 8:45, I heard those 4 familiar knocks at the front door. I stayed completely still and did not respond. A few seconds later, there were 4 more knocks, followed by a heavy silence. I waited in the dark, holding my breath. A minute went by, and then I heard a brand new sound. It was a soft, dull thud against the back of the house, followed by another one. I suddenly realized what was happening. Someone was testing my back door. I grabbed my phone, slipped out of bed, and quietly walked into the hallway. From there, I could clearly hear the metal doorknob of the back door slowly turning. It would turn, stop, and then turn again. I immediately dialed 911, keeping my voice down to a terrified whisper, and told the dispatcher that someone was actively trying to break into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking suddenly started up again at the front door. The dispatcher assured me that officers were already on their way to my location, but the back doorknob just kept turning, and then I heard a light, metallic scraping sound against the door frame. It sounded like someone was trying to jam a tool into the lock. It became clear to me that there was more than one person out there. After about 30 agonizing seconds, all the noises suddenly stopped. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher in absolute silence until I finally saw the flashing blue lights of the police cars reflecting through my windows. When the officers searched the exterior of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door, right next to the handle. One of the officers told me straight out that if I had not been home to secure the house and call them, the door would have likely been forced wide open. They searched the surrounding neighborhood, but could not find anyone suspicious that night. The next evening, I decided I could not stay there anymore. I packed a small bag and went to stay at my brother's apartment on the other side of town. I made sure not to post anything about my whereabouts on social media. I just left. Around 9 o'clock that night, my phone started ringing. It was my neighbor who lived 2 houses down. She asked me if I was home because she could see someone standing on my front porch, knocking repeatedly. She said he had been standing there for at least 5 minutes. I told her I was not home and asked if he had a car parked nearby. She said she did not see any vehicle at all. I asked her to call the police right away. When the officers arrived, they found the man still on my porch and began questioning him. Later that night, an officer called me to give me an update. He said the man claimed he was simply trying to deliver a package but had somehow misplaced it. However, he did not have any company identification, no delivery uniform, and no marked vehicle. The police gave him a strong warning to stay away from the property and let him go. But the story did not end there. Just 2 days later, the police arrested the exact same man in a nearby neighborhood. He had been caught red-handed attempting to break into a house whose owners were away on vacation. When the police searched his car, they found several empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that was completely fake and not connected to any real delivery company. During his interrogation, he finally admitted to his entire method. He confessed that he would knock on doors holding a fake package as a test. If someone answered, he would pretend it was a mistaken delivery, leave, and mark the house as occupied. But if nobody answered after multiple attempts, he would return later that night to force his way inside. He even told the detectives that he would sometimes knock several nights in a row just to study the patterns of the residents. If he saw lights on one night and completely dark the next, he would assume the residents were out and that the house was safe to rob. Hearing those words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I realized just how incredibly close I had come to disaster during that first week. If I had decided to ignore the door on those early nights, he probably would have broken in while I was asleep or away. 3 months later, as soon as my lease was up, I packed my things and moved out of that house. To this day, I still refuse to answer the door at night unless I know exactly who is coming. If I hear an unexpected knock, I stay completely quiet and check my security cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up on my porch with a package that has my address but not my name, I do not even think about going near the door. Now, let us move on to another story that took place during a time of year that is supposed to be filled with joy and family warmth, but instead turned into an absolute nightmare. This event began in the cold winter days leading up to Christmas in a town near Glasgow, Scotland. At the time, I was 16 years old, just about to turn 17. I lived in a lovely home with my parents, my siblings, and our family dogs and cats. We were a very close family, and we loved spending our winter evenings together in the living room, watching movies, playing games, and just catching up on each other's lives. It was one of those cozy nights when we were all gathered around the television watching A Christmas Carol. This was a classic tradition for us, and I always looked forward to it. But right in the middle of the movie, we heard a sudden knock at the front door. Since it was the holiday season, we did not think much of it, assuming it might be a neighbor or a delivery. My mom got up from her chair and went to answer it, but when she opened the door, the front porch was completely empty. There was nobody there, our garden wrapped all the way from the front of the house to the back, so she checked the side paths, but she found absolutely nothing. She came back inside, slightly confused, and we went back to watching our movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table, focusing hard on some exam preparation work. The house was quiet when suddenly I heard that same knock at the front door. I put my pen down, got up, and went to open it. Once again, there was absolutely nobody there. The street was completely still. At that point, we all assumed it must be some local neighborhood kids playing a prank. In Scotland, there is a very common game that kids play called Chappie. The rules are simple. Kids run up to a house, knock as hard as they can, and then run away laughing to hide. It is a silly game, but for kids, the quick rush of adrenaline from seeing an adult open an empty door is strangely exciting. We had a family group chat where we would keep each other updated, and over the course of that week, several other family members posted that they had experienced the exact same random knocks. But the one incident that really started to worry us happened to my dad. My dad was a bit of a night owl back then. He would usually stay up much later than the rest of the house, either playing video games on his Xbox or watching television once everyone else had gone to sleep. One night around 11:30, when the entire street was completely silent and all the neighborhood kids were definitely inside their homes, my dad heard a very quiet, gentle knock on the door. He was immediately confused because of how late it was. He walked over to the door and looked through the peephole first, but he did not see anyone. He slowly unlocked the door and opened it to look out into the night. The street was totally empty and silent. He locked the door back up, came upstairs, and asked if any of us had heard the noise. But because the knock had been so incredibly quiet, the rest of us had been fast asleep and heard nothing. This was the moment when a strange feeling of unease began to settle over the household. It was happening too often, and yet nobody had ever seen or heard anyone running away. Usually, when kids play Chappie, you can hear them whispering, giggling, or running down the pavement. But with these knocks, there was only ever dead silence. It felt like someone was standing there, knocking, and then just vanishing into thin air. When Christmas Day finally arrived, we tried to put the weird occurrences out of our minds. We spent the entire day opening presents, sharing gifts, playing family games, and eating far too much food. It was a wonderful, happy day. But later that night, all that rich holiday food started to catch up with me, and I began to feel really sick to my stomach. I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom to lie down for a bit. I ended up falling asleep and woke up much later. I reached over to check my phone, and the screen read 2:01 in the morning. The entire house was pitch black and completely silent. Everyone else had gone to bed hours ago. I knew right away that I would not be able to fall back asleep, because once I wake up in the middle of the night, my mind starts racing and sleep becomes impossible. So I just stayed in bed, scrolling through social media on my phone in the dark, watching videos of people showing off their Christmas presents, and texting a few friends who were also still awake. It is that typical holiday break behavior when you do not have school or any real responsibilities, and you just want to enjoy the late night freedom. But then, in the middle of the silence, I heard a very faint, muffled knock. I froze. I could not tell if the sound had come from my bedroom door, my window, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me because of all the weird events from the previous weeks. I sat up straight in my bed, staring into the darkness of my room with my heart pounding against my ribs. I was too terrified to move. I knew for a fact that absolutely nobody should be outside our house at 2 in the morning on Christmas night. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so the idea of someone knocking on my window seemed almost impossible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered enough courage to get out of bed and open my bedroom door. But just as I cracked it open, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain instantly tried to rationalize it. I thought it must be my dad coming up to bed after staying up late to play his games. I stepped out onto the landing, fully intending to tell him that I was still awake. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized with absolute horror that it was not my dad. Standing on the stairs was a complete stranger, a man I had never seen before in my entire life. I felt a wave of pure sickness wash over me. I wondered if this was the person who had been knocking on our door all those weeks, and now he was already inside our home. He was staggering and swaying as he climbed the steps, looking heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed away into my bedroom, desperately praying he would not notice me. Fortunately, he was too disoriented to look up, and I managed to quietly shut my door. I stood there, listening intently, as his footsteps shuffled around the landing. I could hear him opening doors, walking into one room after another. I realized with sheer panic that it was only a matter of time before he reached my door. I was completely frozen. All my logic and sense seemed to vanish in that moment of pure terror. After a few moments, I gently cracked my door open again to see where he was. I saw him stumbling out of my younger sister's bedroom. Seeing him near my sister's room finally snapped my brain back into action. I slipped out of my room, ran straight to my parents' bedroom, and shook them awake, whispering frantically that there was an intruder inside the house. My mom woke up instantly, but my dad was still groggy and confused. We all crept downstairs together to see what was happening. When we reached the living room, we were shocked to find the man completely passed out on our couch. He had found my dad's beer bottles, opened several of them, and scattered them all over the floor around him. My mom immediately lost her temper and began shouting at him to get out of our house. The man stirred slightly, opened his eyes, and angrily started insisting that this was his house and that we were the ones who needed to leave. We tried to pull him up, but his body was completely limp, like dead weight. My mom even slapped him across the face to try and wake him up, but he barely reacted. Just then, my dad came fully down the stairs, saw the situation, and immediately took charge. He roared at the man, telling him in no uncertain terms that he did not live here, and that he had to get out immediately. The man stubbornly refused. Seeing no other option, my dad physically grabbed the man, lifted him off the couch, and dragged him toward the side door of the house. He shoved him out into the cold night, and warned him never to show his face here again, before slamming the door shut and locking it. We all stood there, breathing heavily, thinking the nightmare was finally over. But just seconds later, a violent crash shattered the silence. The man had swung his fist and punched directly through the glass window next to the door. Shards of broken glass flew everywhere, scattering across the floor. Then, he pushed his bleeding face right through the broken pane, staring at us with wild eyes, looking exactly like that famous scene from the movie The Shining. While my dad ran to grab the phone to call the police, the man began screaming terrifying threats at us. He kept shouting that he owned the house now, that he knew exactly what all of our faces looked like, and that he was going to come back to get us. We were all in a state of absolute shock and terror. It was hard to process that something so violent and bizarre was happening to us on Christmas night. After a few minutes of screaming, the man finally stumbled away into the darkness. Shortly after, the police arrived at our house and began taking detailed statements from all of us. Since I was the one who had spotted him on the stairs, first, my statement took the longest. Fortunately, because it was the middle of winter, it had actually snowed that night. In our part of Scotland, we usually just get wet slush, so having actual fresh snow on the ground was quite rare. And that snow turned out to be the key to finding him. There was a very clear, bright trail of red blood leading right down our street. The police officers followed the bloody tracks easily, and they led them straight to a nearby neighborhood playground. There, lying on the ground in the snow, they found the man. His hands were covered in cuts and embedded with shards of broken glass. They arrested him on the spot and confirmed to us that they believed he was the intruder. The very next morning, we had our broken window replaced. We sat down and explained everything to my younger siblings, who had miraculously slept through the entire chaotic ordeal, probably because they were completely exhausted from all the Christmas excitement and food. Because of my age and the terrifying threats the man had made toward us, I was granted a formal restraining order against him. He was eventually fined for the property damage and sentenced to community service instead of jail time. During his police interrogation, the detectives questioned him about the weeks of mysterious knocking that had occurred before his break-in, but the man swore he knew absolutely nothing about that. He denied ever coming near our house before that night. It turned out that he actually used to live in our house many years before my family had moved in. He claimed that he had no bad intentions whatsoever, saying he had simply had far too much to drink while out celebrating with his friends, and had accidentally walked into his old home by mistake. We were incredibly grateful that nobody in our family was seriously injured. The only actual injury was a bruised wrist that my mom got from slapping him while wearing heavy metal bracelets. It turns out that slapping someone while wearing jewelry hurts you a lot more than it hurts them. But to this day, we have never found any explanation for the strange knocking sounds that plagued our house in the weeks leading up to that night. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes think I hear a faint knock at the door late at night. Sometimes I wonder if it is just my imagination playing tricks on me, or if there really was someone else out there in the dark, watching our house and waiting for the right moment. I suppose I will never truly know the answer. Our next story takes us back to around the year 2010, when I was just a young child of about 6 years old. My family was living in a quiet, cozy neighborhood in the city of Springfield, Oregon. Our household consisted of my mother, my older brother, my older sister, and myself. My dad was not with us at the time because he was deployed overseas with the military. I was extremely close with my dad, and whenever he was away for long stretches of time, it was always very hard on me. One late evening, it was pouring rain outside. My mom went out onto the front porch to have a cigarette, and I decided to sit out there with her to watch the rain fall. Even though it was quite cold and damp, I really enjoyed just sitting there in the quiet, spending that peaceful time with my mother. But as we were watching the rain bounce off the pavement, we noticed something strange. A man was walking right down the middle of our street. What made him stand out immediately was that he was wearing a very bright, oversized yellow rain jacket. It was a striking sight because it was incredibly late at night. The rain was coming down in sheets, and there was absolutely nobody else out on the road. My mom and I both watched him closely. As he got closer to our house, he began to steer his path slightly toward our driveway. My mom immediately stood up, put her cigarette out, and grabbed my hand tightly. We stood there on the porch and watched as the man came to a complete stop right next to the garbage cans at the edge of our driveway. My mom turned around to quickly usher me inside the safety of the house, and that was when the man suddenly began to scream at us. I cannot remember the exact words he was yelling, but I will never forget the absolute terror I felt as my mom hurried me through the front door. The moment we were inside, my mom locked the door shut and immediately turned off all the lights in the house, plunging us in darkness. I was absolutely terrified. Being only 6 years old, I burst into tears. My mom quickly gathered my siblings and me, shushing us gently, and led us all into my parents' large king-sized bed. We all huddled together under the blankets, feeling incredibly anxious and worried about the strange man outside. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing else happened. There was no more yelling, no strange noises, and no signs of the man. Eventually, the warmth of the bed overcame our fear, and we all drifted off to sleep. But that night, I had a horrible, vivid nightmare that I can still picture perfectly to this day. In the dream, I saw a man wearing that same massive yellow rain jacket, standing right outside our bedroom window, peering in at us through the glass. I woke up from the nightmare in a state of pure panic, crying and shaking uncontrollably. I reached over and shook my sister awake, crying as I told her how scared I was. I have no idea what time it actually was. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the master bathroom that was attached directly to the bedroom. She shut the door behind us and sat with me, talking to me in quiet whispers to help calm me down without waking up our mom or brother. But while we were sitting there in the bathroom, a sudden violent noise shattered the quiet. It was a loud, aggressive banging on our front door. My sister gasped, threw the bathroom door open, and ran over to my mom's side of the bed, shaking her awake as fast as she could without saying a word. My brother woke up instantly from the loud noise too. I sat frozen on the bathroom floor, completely terrified, as my mom gestured for my brother and sister to quickly join me inside the bathroom. We all huddled together on the floor, crying and shaking with fear, while the heavy, rhythmic banging on the front door continued to echo through the dark house. My mom went out into the hallway, trying to find her old BlackBerry phone so she could call the police. But in her panic, she could not find it anywhere. That meant we had absolutely no way to call for help. We sat there in the dark bathroom, listening to the man outside. He was not just knocking anymore. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that we let him inside, all while slamming his fists against the door. It was the most helpless, terrifying night of my entire life. It was just my mom and her 3 young children, with no phone, and my dad was thousands of miles away. We huddled close on the bathroom floor, crying and praying that one of our neighbors would hear the commotion and call the police. But nobody did. Eventually, the screaming and banging faded away, and the man left. No police ever showed up. What was so bizarre to us was that our neighborhood was quite small, with the houses built very close together. Our house was actually a duplex, sharing a wall with another family. How not a single neighbor managed to hear a grown man screaming and slamming on a door in the middle of the night was completely beyond us. Eventually, we managed to get back to sleep, and for a few weeks, everything seemed to return to normal. But the peace did not last long. Not even a month later, while it was still just the 5 of us in the house, my family woke up one morning to a chilling sight. Our front door was standing wide open. Not only that, but one of our windows was pushed open, and there was a giant, clean hole cut directly through the window screen. My mom immediately grabbed her phone and called the police. As we went through the house, we realized that several random items were missing. My piggy bank, which contained all of my holiday savings, was gone. Other random household items had been taken as well, but by far the most disturbing thing that was stolen was a large glass vase. For months, our family had been filling this vase with spare cash and coins, saving up for a special occasion, and the absolute most sickening part of it all was where that vase had been sitting. It had been placed right on my nightstand, directly next to the bed where my sister and I had been sleeping soundly all night. The thought that an intruder had stood right next to our sleeping bodies in the dark was absolutely horrifying. Because this happened so long ago, and because my mother has sadly passed away since then, many of the details of the police investigation have been lost to time. My dad was not there when the actual break-in occurred, so he could not fill in the blanks either. We never found out for sure if the intruder was ever officially caught by the authorities. I also still do not know to this day if the aggressive man in the yellow rain jacket was the same person who broke into our home weeks later. It could have been connected, or it could have been a completely different criminal. But there was one strange detail that we noticed later on. A few weeks after the burglary, I happened to look over at the porch of one of our neighbors. He was a quiet man who lived completely alone, and we rarely ever saw him leave his house. But sitting right there on his front porch was a large glass vase that looked identical to the one that had been stolen from my nightstand. We never got proof, and we never knew for sure, but the sight of it always left a lingering, unsettling feeling in my chest. This final story took place about 3 years ago, while I was living in Idaho serving a full-time religious mission. The small town where my companion, whom I will call Spencer, and I were assigned was incredibly small and remote. Because of how quiet the area was, there was not always a lot of work for us to do. To make matters worse, I was going through a really difficult personal patch at the time, struggling with low self-esteem and sleep issues. As a result of all this stress, Spencer and I found it really hard to stay out working all day long, so we spent a lot of time resting at home. We were renting a very tiny house, which was our only real option because there were simply no apartment buildings nearby. The layout of our tiny home was extremely simple. When you walked through the front door, you immediately stepped into the main living room where our desks were set up. To your immediate right was our bedroom door. If you kept walking straight, you would pass through a wide open doorway leading directly into the kitchen. Once you were in the kitchen, the bathroom was on your right, and the laundry room was on your left. It is also important to note that our landlord's house was located right next door, only a short distance away. If we ever ran into any issues, we could easily walk over or give him a quick phone call. On the night this happened, it had gotten dark quite early. Spencer and I were relaxing before going to bed. I was sitting at my desk in the living room, looking at my phone, while Spencer was sitting on his bed in the other room. In the middle of the quiet evening, I suddenly heard a single, distinct knock. It came from the kitchen window right above the sink. Because of our house layout, anyone standing at that kitchen window would have a clear view of the entire living area where I was sitting. I looked up immediately, but all I could see was the pitch black night. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it must have just been a tree branch brushing against the glass. But the more I thought about it, the more unlikely that seemed. None of the tree branches were close enough to touch the window. Just as I was having this thought, another knock sounded. This time, it came from the window in the laundry room around the corner. A heavy feeling of dread settled in my stomach. I called out to Spencer to tell him what I was hearing, but as the words left my mouth, a third knock sounded. It came from the living room window, directly next to where I was sitting. I did not look to see who was on the other side. I bolted from my chair, ran into the bedroom, and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I asked Spencer if he had heard it too, and his wide eyes told me everything. He had. We began to whisper frantically, debating what we should do. The only potential weapons we had in the entire house were a couple of small kitchen knives, and we had no idea how many people were outside, or if they were carrying weapons. Going outside to confront them was completely out of the question. As we were trying to decide on a plan, the knocking sound moved once again. This time it came from the front door itself. The knocks were steady and deliberate, and we were getting more and more terrified by the second. We talked about calling the police, but we were so far out in the middle of nowhere that we knew it would take a very long time for them to reach us. That was when Spencer remembered we had our landlord's phone number. He quickly dialed the number and began explaining the emergency. By this point, the knocking at the front door had stopped, but I knew what was coming next, and I was absolutely dreading it. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the knocks came directly against our bedroom window. Spencer told the landlord what was happening, and the landlord told us to stay exactly where we were. He said he was grabbing his shotgun and would be right over. We waited in total silence for several minutes, holding our breath, but nothing happened. Finally, we heard our landlord's voice calling out to us from the front door. We unlocked the bedroom door and let him in. He told us that as he was walking over, he saw a pickup truck suddenly speed away down the dark road. He said it was already too far away in the dark for him to see any details. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights, and together with our landlord, we went outside to inspect the property. There were still a few small patches of snow left on the ground from a winter storm. In those patches of snow, we found a clear set of footprints circling the entire house, going from window to window. As far as we could tell, there was only one set of tracks. We debated calling the police to report it, but we knew they would have a hard time finding a random truck with no license plate. Our landlord told us to call him immediately if the truck returned, and then he went back to his house. We locked every lock, turned off the lights, and tried to get some sleep, but neither of us could close our eyes. We wondered if it could have been other missionaries playing a mean prank on us, but if it was, they never revealed themselves or said anything afterward. Plus, it was way past our strict curfew. We also wondered if it was local teenagers, but a prank like that is usually done in a group, and we had only found one single set of footprints. We asked around the community over the next few weeks, but nobody ever confessed to doing it. To this day, I still have no idea who was outside our house that night, or why they chose to target us. But the absolute scariest part of the entire experience was realizing that when the very first knock happened at the kitchen window, I had looked directly at that window. That means I was likely staring right into the eyes of the stalker in the dark, and I did not even realize it. From that night on, my sleeping issues only grew much worse, and my personal struggles did not improve. I ended up leaving the area eventually, and I know for a fact that I will never set foot near that tiny house again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. My name is Patrick McCabe, and growing up, I had some of the most severely misaligned teeth you could possibly imagine. It was a massive aesthetic nightmare, and it impacted my self-confidence deeply. Because of this and a variety of personal circumstances, I ended up getting my wisdom teeth removed much later in life than most people do. Normally, teenagers undergo this procedure during high school, or at the very latest, during their early college years. But I was different. I did not even sit down for an initial consultation with an oral surgeon until after I had already graduated from college. The extraction process was incredibly painful, and the recovery turned out to be one of the most physically irritating, exhausting periods of my entire life. I will not bore you with every single detail about the swelling, the liquid diet, and the constant ice packs, but there is one crucial detail that you absolutely must know. For whatever reason, The post-surgery pain I was experiencing was so severe that I could not sleep through the night without taking heavy pain medication. To cope with this, I developed a strict system. I set alarms to wake myself up every 3 hours, on the dot, to take another pill, constantly cycling between the 2 different medications I had been prescribed. It was an awful, draining cycle, but it was the only way to prevent massive, throbbing toothaches that would otherwise have me awake and quite literally in tears. As you can imagine, my sleep schedule was completely destroyed during this period. My body quickly became accustomed to sleeping in short, 3-hour bursts, followed by periods of groggy wakefulness, and it was incredibly difficult to return to a normal routine even after my physical recovery was over. That was honestly the worst part of it all. The sleep deprivation made me feel like I was barely human anymore. I was constantly waking up, staring at the walls, taking pills, and trying to drift back into a restless sleep. It was a bizarre, exhausting existence, and I hate even thinking back on it now. One night, during the first week of my recovery, my alarm went off at around 4 o'clock in the morning. I got up, took my medication as scheduled, but for some reason, I just could not fall back asleep afterward. I do not know if it was a side effect of the pills, or the fact that our central air conditioning had suddenly stopped working, but it was incredibly hot in my bedroom. It felt way hotter than usual, almost suffocating. I remember tossing and turning for about 10 minutes, feeling increasingly frustrated, before deciding I had to do something about the heat. The only thing I could think of was to slide my bedroom window open, which I did. That helped let in a slight breeze, but I still lay there, completely unable to drift off. So there I was, lying miserably in bed in the dark, praying with every fiber of my being that my eyes would grow heavy, but of course they did not. At one point, as I lay there in the quiet room, I started picking up on a very strange, distinct noise coming from just outside my window. Since I never slept with my window open, my initial thought was that it was just some normal outdoor sound that I simply was not used to hearing. But the more I listened, the more I got the feeling that it was not normal at all. It sounded like a persistent scratching, as if some kind of small animal were dragging its sharp claws across a hard surface. That is the best way I can describe it. After a few minutes, the scratching noise grew significantly louder, and I realized with a jolt of alarm that it was coming from directly above me. It was on the roof. And then, a few seconds later, the scratching started to move across the shingles, gradually fading out of earshot as it traveled toward the front of the house. At this point, I was pretty positive that it was some kind of wild critter messing around on the roof. My family lives in a very heavily wooded area, so we have had our fair share of curious raccoons, squirrels, and pest infestations over the years. I really wanted to just ignore the sound, pull the blankets over my head and try to sleep, but I knew my dad would be absolutely livid if another animal managed to burrow its way into our attic. The last time that happened, it caused a lot of expensive structural damage, so I had to do something about it. Plus, it was not like I was on the brink of falling asleep anyway. I was wide awake, my mind racing from the heat and the broken sleep. Without thinking about it too much, I threw my covers off, stood up, and made my way through the quiet house toward the garage. Once inside, I grabbed one of my dad's heavy-duty metal flashlights and walked back through the dark hallway to the back door. My bedroom sits on the ground floor near the rear of the house, which is where the roof line is at its lowest and most accessible point, so I figured I would check that area first. I unlocked the back door, stepped out into the humid night, and made my way over to the spot right beneath my bedroom window. I clicked on the flashlight and started sweeping the powerful beam of light across the roof shingles. I did not see anything up there. I let out a sigh, assuming the animal had simply scrambled to a different section of the roof in the time it had taken me to get out of bed and walk outside. But I wanted to be sure it was gone, so I began walking around the side of the house, trying my best to illuminate as much of the roof as possible. I figured all I needed to do was catch the animal in the light to scare it away, which would be easy enough if I could just find the damn thing. I was slowly scanning the roof near the front of the house, where the architecture of the building rises nearly twice as high, when I suddenly spotted something shift in the very corner of my flashlight beam. It was a quick, sudden movement that did not look like a small animal. With a rapid flick of my wrist, I shot the full beam of the flashlight directly toward the spot where I had seen the motion. and I nearly passed out from the sheer shock of what I saw. There, standing upright on the sloping roof of my family home, was a person. It was not a raccoon, it was not a wild animal, but a fully grown naked human being. They were standing completely still on the shingles, frozen like a deer in the bright beam of my flashlight. I let out a loud, involuntary scream. The moment my voice cut through the silence, the person on the roof started moving with terrifying speed, almost as if they were physically allergic to the light. I tried my best to track their movements with the flashlight, but they were absurdly fast. Until that exact moment, I did not know it was possible for a human being to move so quickly barefoot, let alone on the loose, uneven shingles of a steep roof. They began scrambling back toward the lower section of the roof near my bedroom window, and without thinking, I sprinted around the side of the house to intercept them. I do not even know what I was thinking. Looking back, I know I should have run back inside the house, locked the door, and called the police immediately. But some deep, primal survival instinct took over, and I refused to back down. I yelled at the top of my lungs for my dad as I ran, hoping he would hear me, wake up, and get outside in time to help me ward off this psycho on our roof. I rounded the corner and reached the backyard just in time to see the naked figure positioning themselves at the edge of the roof, preparing to jump. My first thought was that there was no way they would actually do it, because even from the lower roof, the drop to the ground was significant. I expected them to suffer serious injuries if they jumped onto the concrete below. But without a single second of hesitation, the person leaped off the roof, slamming into the concrete patio with a deafening, sickening thud. The sheer shock of witnessing that jump froze me completely in place. I could not even process the insanity of what I was seeing. My dazed shock only lasted for a split second, but that was all the time the intruder needed. The person immediately got up off the concrete pavers, completely unfazed by the impact, and charged directly at me, tackling me violently to the ground. Before I could even raise my hands to defend myself, he was on top of me, clawing wildly at my eyes and face as if he were trying to rip my skin off. I screamed and kicked with everything I had, but I could not get him off me. He was emitting these horrible guttural grunts and spitting on me, and there was no logical explanation for how someone of his build could be so terrifyingly strong. I could feel warm blood pouring down my face, and in that horrifying moment, I genuinely believed I was going to die. But then, over the sound of my own screams, I heard our back door burst open. A second later, my dad was there, pulling the crazed man off of me, cursing and yelling as if his own life depended on it. It was a life or death struggle. I managed to push myself up off the ground just in time to see the psycho break completely free of my dad's grasp, covered in my blood. Instead of continuing the attack, he turned, ran to the edge of our yard, scaled our high wooden fence, and vanished into the darkness of the woods. My dad and I stood there in complete shock, breathing heavily, while the sound of his footsteps crashing through the brush faded into the distance. The rest of that night was a blur. I had to go to the emergency room immediately, because I had lost a significant amount of blood from the deep scratches on my face. My dad was so shaken up that he almost crashed the car on the way to the hospital. The doctors had to give me numerous shots to prevent any potential infections or diseases, which was an absolute nightmare. The only saving grace was that my mouth was untouched, so my healing wisdom teeth did not need to be re-examined. The police were largely useless, stating that searching the vast woods at that hour was impossible, and they suggested that simple security cameras would have prevented the entire thing. Later, my dad discovered that the person on the roof had actually been trying to claw and dig their way directly into our attic, like a wild animal. Ironically, it was my mom who was the most psychologically affected by the incident. She cried about it for weeks and was the one who insisted on upgrading our home security. I still have no explanation for what happened that night, who that guy was, or how he found our house, and I fear those questions will never be answered. But the problem was, Patrick's terrifying encounter with a midnight intruder is not the only story of its kind. Sometimes the threat does not come from the roof. Sometimes it stands right at your front door, watching you through the glass. To understand this next story, you have to understand the physical layout of my family's house. It is a very unique design. Honestly, I call it unique. But if I am being completely honest, most people who visit would just call it weird. And actually, many of them have. The vast majority of friends I have hosted over the years have commented on how strange the entryway is, and even a few girls I snuck in while my parents were away made comments about the unusual floor plan. I wish I could just attach photos of the house to make it easier for you to visualize. But my parents are very private people and would not appreciate me sharing pictures of their home online. So, instead, I will do my best to explain the most important architectural detail. You know how most houses have a normal front porch or a walkway leading directly to the front door, with some sort of small covering above it. Well, my house does not have that. Instead, it has a long, covered external hallway that you have to walk through before you actually reach the front door. Imagine your own front door, but instead of it being flush with the front of the house, the entrance is pushed deep into the center of the structure. It is essentially like walking between two separate wings of the house while still technically being outdoors. This design means that my ground floor bedroom sits right next to this external hallway. There is a window right next to my bed, and if I stand up and peel back the curtain, I can look directly out into that covered hallway and see anyone standing at our front door. Because of the angle, they would have their back to me, completely unaware that I was watching them. I developed a habit at a very young age of peeping out of that window whenever a delivery person or a guest would ring our doorbell. It was like having my own personal hidden security camera. What I am about to tell you happened just a few months ago, at the very beginning of the summer. My parents had gone out of town for a week-long trip, and I decided to take advantage of the empty house by inviting my girlfriend, Anna, to sleep over for a few days. My parents are very strict and traditional, so they would have been incredibly opposed to the idea if they knew. But we figured what they did not know would not hurt them. Plus, they had met Anna dozens of times and loved her, so it was not like I was bringing a stranger into the house. The first night of her stay was peaceful and completely uneventful. We just had a relaxed movie night, ordered some food, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The next morning we woke up, spent some time swimming in the backyard pool, and just enjoyed each other's company. Neither Anna nor I are big party people, so we were perfectly content just staying in and watching television. But the second night was when everything went completely wrong. It was probably around midnight, and the house was pitch black. Anna and I were lying in my bed, whispering to each other in the dark, just having some casual pillow talk before drifting off to sleep. Suddenly, a strange sound drifted in from outside, cutting through our conversation. It was a harsh scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged slowly across concrete. I immediately shushed Anna, freezing in place to listen closely. The sound seemed to be coming from the driveway area, which sits off to the side of the house. That immediately put me on edge, because it meant whatever was making the noise was incredibly close to the building. I kept listening, trying to identify the sound, and after a few seconds it clicked. It was the distinct sound of one of my dad's heavy plastic trash cans being dragged across the asphalt. My first instinct was that an animal, probably a raccoon or a stray dog, was rummaging through the garbage looking for food scraps. Still, even if it was just an animal, hearing something moving around so close to your house in the middle of the night is deeply unsettling, especially when your parents are hundreds of miles away and you are responsible for the property. I turned to Anna and told her to stay in bed, reassuring her that I was just going to go outside and scare off whatever animal was messing with the trash. I got out of bed, walked quietly out of my bedroom, and made my way to the front door. I reached for the light switch and turned on the exterior floodlights, hoping the sudden burst of light would be enough to frighten the animal away. But when I looked through the peephole, the floodlights only illuminated the front yard and the porch. They did not reach far enough around the side of the house to show me the driveway. Reluctantly, I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch, hoping that just the sound of the door opening and the presence of a human would be enough to send the creature running. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, straining my eyes in the darkness, waiting to hear the sound of paws scampering away or to see something dart across the lawn, but there was nothing. The noise had completely stopped, and the night was dead silent. I figured there was a chance the animal had already run off, but I wanted to be absolutely sure. So, with a feeling of growing unease, I turned on my phone's flashlight and began walking down the front steps toward the driveway. As I rounded the corner, My flashlight beam caught the trash cans. One of them had indeed been messed with, while two of them were still standing neatly against the garage door. The third one had been completely knocked over, and its contents were scattered all over the driveway. I let out a frustrated sigh, realizing I would have to clean up the mess. I scanned the area with my flashlight, looking for any sign of the animal that had done this, but the driveway was completely empty. I assumed the creature had slipped away into the shadows when I opened the front door. Not wanting to leave a mess for the morning, I knelt down and started gathering the loose trash, throwing it back into the overturned bin. Once I was finished, I decided I did not want to risk the animal returning later in the night and waking us up again. So I opened the garage door, dragged all 3 trash cans inside, and locked the garage up tight. Feeling a bit more secure, I walked back into the house, locked the front door, and returned to my bedroom. Anna was still awake, but she was barely clinging to consciousness. I could tell she was on the verge of falling asleep, so I quietly climbed back into bed, gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead, and tried to get comfortable on my side of the mattress without disturbing her. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift, entering that strange hazy middle ground between wakefulness and sleep, where your thoughts start to turn into dreams. But just as I was about to fully drift off, a sound snapped me back to reality. It was a very faint, delicate tapping noise. It sounded like metal gently striking glass. At first, in my half-asleep state, I tried to convince myself that it was just part of a dream I was beginning to have. But there was something about the rhythm of the sound that felt too real, too deliberate. It was incredibly unsettling. I forced my eyes open and stared into the darkness of my bedroom. The tapping did not stop. It was a consistent, slow sound. I lay perfectly still, not moving a single muscle, just breathing quietly and trying to figure out where the tapping was coming from. After a few seconds, I realized with a sudden spike of adrenaline that the sound was not coming from inside my room. It was coming from just outside. It was coming from my bedroom window. I slowly slid out from under the covers, trying not to make a sound or wake Anna. I stood up, walked over to the window, and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain, just enough to peer out into the covered external hallway. In the dim, ambient light filtering in from the street, I could clearly see the dark outline of a person standing directly in front of our front door. Their back was turned to me, just as I had pictured. I stood there, frozen, watching them. They were holding something small in their hand, and they were lightly, repeatedly tapping it against the glass pane of the front door, over and over and over again, in a steady, creepy rhythm, as if they were waiting for someone to come and answer. It was absolutely insane. It was past midnight, the house was completely dark, and this stranger was just standing there, tapping on the glass. I tried to make out the details of their clothing or their height, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. As I stood there transfixed by terror, I suddenly saw the figure's shoulders shift. They were starting to turn around. Panic flared in my chest. Without thinking, I quickly ducked down below the windowsill, letting the curtain fall back into place. My heart was pounding so hard I was worried the person outside would hear it. I crouched there on the floor in the pitch black, terrified that they had spotted my movement through the glass. I stayed in that position for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, trying to gather the courage to look again. I knew I had to look. I had to know if they were still there, or if they were trying to find a way inside. Taking a deep breath, I slowly stood back up and peeled the curtain back, just a fraction of an inch. I instantly regretted it. There, less than 2 inches away from the glass of my window, was a human face staring directly at me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and recoiled in pure terror, falling backward onto the floor and yanking the curtain shut. Even though we were face to face for only a split second, the image of that person's face was burned into my mind. It was a man, but his skin looked horribly shriveled and distorted, almost as if his face were melting away. It was the most grotesque, terrifying thing I had ever seen. My scream woke Anna up instantly. She sat up in bed, confused and frightened, as I scrambled across the floor, yelling that there was someone right outside the window. I ran to the bedroom door, made sure it was locked, and then grabbed my phone with shaking hands to dial the police. Anna was crying, clutching onto my arm so tightly it bruised, begging me not to leave her side. We stayed locked in that room, listening to the silence, terrified that we would hear the sound of breaking glass or footsteps inside the house. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, their headlights sweeping across the walls of my bedroom. I unlocked the door and let them in, my voice trembling as I explained what I had seen. They conducted a thorough search of the interior of the house, confirming that all the doors and windows were still locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. That brought me some small amount of relief, but the dread remained. The officers then searched the exterior of the property, walking the perimeter with their high-powered flashlights and checking the yard, but they found absolutely nothing. The stranger with the melting face had vanished into the night. One of the officers told me to keep the doors locked and to call them back immediately if I saw the man again, and then they left. The rest of the week passed without any more incidents. When my parents finally returned home, I sat them down and told them the entire story. To my complete surprise, they did not seem very concerned. They lived in a very safe, quiet neighborhood, and they seemed to think it was just a one-off encounter with a confused or intoxicated homeless person. Their casual reaction actually made me feel like I was overreacting, like I had allowed my imagination to run wild. I tried to convince myself that they were right, that it was nothing to worry about. But if that were true, I would not be writing this story today. The reason I am sharing this is because for the past 3 nights, I have been waking up in the middle of the night to strange noises outside my window. They are not the sounds of trash cans being moved. They are different, stealthier sounds, like quiet footsteps shuffling in the dirt right outside my room. I told my dad about it again, and this time, he finally agreed to install some high-definition security cameras around the perimeter of the house. But even with the cameras coming, I cannot shake the terrifying feeling that the man with the melting face is still out there, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to tap on my glass again. And then we have the third story, which is perhaps the most bizarre and psychologically damaging of them all. What you are about to hear is an experience that nearly made me lose my mind. It is still something that I think about almost every single day, even though several months have passed since it happened. I have been able to recover a bit and regain some sense of normalcy, but the underlying fear has never truly left me. I am a single guy in my mid-30s, and I live completely alone. I do not have any roommates, I do not have a partner, and I do not even have any pets. My home is a very modest 1-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It is a simple setup. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small living room, a kitchen, a dining area, and a tiny garage. For me, this life is absolutely fantastic. Because of the nature of my profession, I work entirely as a freelancer on my own schedule. I do not have to answer to a boss. I do not have to worry about a girlfriend's schedule, and I do not have to report to anyone. Freedom has always been the single most important aspect of my life, and I have done everything in my power to maximize that freedom in every way possible. I know that a lot of people live very differently, and some might even look at my life and judge me for what they might consider an immature or isolated lifestyle. But everyone has different priorities, and as long as no one judges me, I won't judge them. However, I have to admit that having this much freedom does come with its fair share of drawbacks. When you do not have anyone keeping you accountable, it is very easy to develop some pretty bad habits. The worst habit I have developed over the years is my sleep schedule, which is completely terrible. For whatever reason, my brain is just wired to be most productive during the late night hours. I find that my focus is sharpest when the rest of the world is asleep. Because of this, I frequently find myself staying up until dawn, working at my computer, and then sleeping late into the afternoon. It is just how my body naturally functions. And since I do not have to go to an office, I have never seen a reason to try and change it. One night I was up exceptionally late. It was well past 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was sitting at my desk in my bedroom, deeply focused on a work project. I was completely in the zone. I did not even have any music playing in the background, which is rare for me. I was just typing away in absolute silence, completely isolated with my thoughts, the soft clicking of my keyboard, and the glow of my monitor. It was the kind of deep, productive focus that you only get when the entire neighborhood is asleep. But then, out of nowhere, that perfect silence was shattered. I heard the sudden, explosive sound of heavy footsteps running at full speed down my hallway. They were pounding against the hardwood floor, heading directly toward my closed bedroom door. Before my brain could even begin to process what was happening, there were 3 or 4 incredibly loud, violent bangs on my bedroom door. They were deafening. It sounded like the police trying to breach a door with a battering ram. The shock of the sound was so intense that I literally vaulted out of my chair. In my panic, I slammed my knee hard against the underside of the desk and knocked my computer monitor completely over. I stood there, trembling, my heart hammering in my chest like a trapped bird. I was completely caught off guard. Just try to put yourself in my shoes for a second. Imagine being completely alone in your house at 3 in the morning, surrounded by total, peaceful silence, and then suddenly hearing someone sprint down your hallway and violently assault your bedroom door. It was, without a doubt, the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. Standing up had been a purely physical reaction, but after that, I was completely frozen. My eyes were fixed on the door, dreading the moment I knew was coming, the door bursting open and someone barging in. But it never came. The silence returned. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps retreating, nothing. It was like I had imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. Eventually, I heard footsteps quickly walking back down the hall. Hearing them again unlocked my brain. I grabbed an empty beer bottle, threw open the door, and chased after whoever had broken in. I screamed at the top of my lungs to get some adrenaline. I ran through the house, but I never found anyone. My house is small, with nowhere to hide. Every door and window was locked from the inside. I sprinted back to my room, locked the door, and called the police. They searched but found nothing, suggesting the intruder had left, but I insisted everything was locked. For the next week, I was a psychological mess, unable to sleep or eat. Why someone would break in just to bang on my door and run away remains a complete mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.